Close your eyes. Let your body settle into wherever you are resting tonight. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now, nothing you need to figure out, nothing waiting for you on the other side of this darkness. There is only this story. And this story begins at the edge of a river, long before the city woke up, long before the birds remembered they were supposed to sing. Before we follow Nanda to the river, let me place you in the village. It is the hour that has no good name. Too late to be night, too early to be morning. The hour when the darkness has begun to thin at the edges without yet admitting to it. When the stars are still fully present but have begun, not almost imperceptibly, to recede. Not gone, just slightly less insistent, the way a voice becomes when it knows the conversation is nearly over. In this village, in this hour, almost everything is still. The cook fires are cold, lanes. Between the houses are empty, in the way of places that will soon be full, already shaped for the movement of people, already arranged for the day's transactions, but holding their breath in the last of the dark. The river is the only thing that does not hold its breath. The river does what rivers do. It runs. It has been running through this particular hour for longer than the village has existed. It will continue running through this hour long after the village has been absorbed into whatever comes next. The river does not participate in the pause that the rest of the world observes before dawn. This is one of the things that makes rivers trustworthy. And on the eastern edge of the village, in the last of the darkness, a man named Nanda was already awake. It begins with a man counting cows. His name was Nanda. Not a great name. Not a name anyone carved into stone. A simple name. The kind that gets called out across a muddy field at dusk when supper is ready and the youngest child is still out somewhere chasing fireflies. Nanda. He had 21 cows. He knew each one by name. Not because someone told him to give them names. No one had ever told Nanda what to do with his heart. But because he had been watching them since they were born, had pulled 2 of them into the world with his own hands on cold January mornings, had carried the weakest ones on his back when the river flooded and the path turned to mud. He knew which one limped slightly on her left leg when the weather was about to change. He knew which one would steal the best grass from the others if he turned his back for even a moment. He knew which one, the old brown one, the one he called Mala, which meant garland, because she had a ring of darker fur around her neck like a necklace, which one would rest her heavy head on his shoulder on nights when the thunder came. 21 cows. Every morning. Not he counted them. Not because he was afraid of losing them, because the counting was a kind of prayer. A way of saying, I am still here, you are still here. The world has not ended overnight. That morning, the morning this story begins, the mist was thick over the river. You know that kind of mist, the kind that makes the world feel like it hasn't fully decided to exist yet. And the kind that turns the trees along the bank into shapes that might be trees or might be something else, something older, something that was here before the trees were. Nanda stood at the edge of the river and counted. 1, 2, 3. He whispered the names as he counted. Mala, Sona, Kali. He didn't need to see them clearly. He could hear them breathing. But something was different that morning. He counted 21 cows. He always had 21 cows. But there at the edge of the water, just where the mud turned soft and dark and held the shape of every foot that had walked across it, there was something that did not belong. A strip of cloth. Yellow, the color of turmeric, of late afternoon sunlight, of the inside of a mango that has been sitting in the sun for exactly the right number of days. It was small, no longer than his forearm, torn at one end, frayed at the other, as if it had been part of something much larger and had simply separated, the way a leaf separates from a branch in autumn, not violently, just time. Nanda picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. The fabric was finer than anything he owned. Finer than anything in his village, probably. It was the kind of cloth that had been washed many times, worn thin with use, softened the way only time and water can soften something. He did not know who it belonged to. He looked up and down the river. The mist moved, the water moved, the cows breathed. No one was there. He folded the cloth and tucked it into the fold of his own much rougher garment against his chest. He did not know why he would carry that small strip of yellow cloth for 3 rainy seasons before he understood what it meant. But we are not there yet. Stay with this morning. No, stay with the river and the mist and the man with muddy feet and 21 cows and a piece of yellow cloth he did not know what to do with. There are mornings in a life that are later recognized as pivots, not because anything dramatic happened in them, because something was received quietly that would only become visible later, the way a seed becomes visible only when it has already been doing its work underground for a long time. This was one of those mornings. But Nanda did not know that. He was thinking about water, about whether the lower pasture had dried enough to be usable, or whether the cows would churn the remaining mud into something worse. He was thinking about a loose post in the fence at the eastern edge that he had been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. He was thinking about the small ache in his right knee that arrived every morning now when the cold came before the light. This is the texture of an ordinary life, not dramatic, not the stuff of stories, the ache in the knee, a post that needs fixing. The mental arithmetic of a man who owns just enough to require maintenance and not quite enough to make the maintenance easy. He had been doing this arithmetic for 20 years. He was very good at it. Now, what he was not good at, what he had never been taught to be good at, because no one in his life had ever thought to teach him, was the other kind of accounting. The one that asked not what needs to be fixed, but what is already whole. Not what is missing, but what is here. Not what the day requires, but what the day contains. He looked at the cloth in his hands. Something about it troubled him, not unpleasantly. The way a question troubles you, the way a question you cannot answer sits at the edge of your attention and makes everything around it slightly more vivid by contrast. He thought about who might have left it, and he thought about the river, about the fact that things left in rivers travel, that something dropped upstream becomes eventually something found downstream. That the river was a kind of slow conversation between places that never directly spoke. He tucked the cloth against his chest. He breathed in the morning. The mist moved, the water moved, and the day began. He did not know, standing there at the river's edge with the yellow cloth in his hands, that he was at the beginning of something. He did not know, standing there at the river's edge with the yellow cloth in his hands, that he was at the beginning of something. This is how beginnings work. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with the fanfare that stories, told later, give them. They arrive as ordinary mornings, as a man going to count his cows, as a piece of fabric in the mud. Later, much later, Nanda would try to remember the feeling of that morning, the mist, the weight of the cloth in his palm, the sound of 21 cows breathing behind him. He would say, I did not feel anything special. I just felt the morning. But the morning had one more thing left to say, and it said it in the only language mornings know, light, slowly. Moving across the water, the way light always moves across water, not arriving from any single direction, but coming, somehow, from the water itself, from inside it. He tucked the cloth away. He turned to his cows, and the morning continued as mornings do, carrying its secret into the day. This is not a story about a saint. This is not a story about a prince who renounced his kingdom and sat under a tree until the stars rearranged themselves. This is not a story about miracles or monks or the men who wrote things down in languages no one speaks anymore. This is a story about a man who had nothing, who owned 21 cows and a patch of land that flooded every monsoon and a pair of sandals that had been repaired so many times there was more repair than original sandal left, who did not know how to read, none, who had never been inside a city, who had never been asked what he thought about anything. This is his story. And in some way that will only become clear later, when the mist has lifted and the stars have done their slow work, this is your story too, Om. The word in Pali, the ancient language of the earliest Buddhist texts, for the particular kind of suffering that Nanda felt every morning without knowing he felt it, is Dukkha. It is usually translated as suffering, but that translation is too loud, too dramatic. Dukkha is quieter than that. Dukkha is the feeling of leaning back in a chair that is almost comfortable, a feeling of a meal that fills your stomach, but not quite whatever it is underneath your stomach that is hungry. Not the feeling of waking up each morning and counting your cows and knowing, without being able to say how you know, that something is not quite right, not wrong, not broken, not in need of dramatic fixing, just not quite right. Nanda had felt this every morning of his life. He had never had a word for it. He had assumed it was simply what being alive felt like. He would discover in time that he was not wrong exactly, but that the discovery of the word, naming of the thing, was the first step towards something he did not yet have a word for either. That morning he drove his cows to the eastern pasture, the one that sloped down toward a bend in the river, where the grass was sweetest and the shade came early in the afternoon. He had been coming to this pasture for 20 years, since he was young enough that the tallest cow came up to his chin. The cows spread out, they knew where to go. Nanda sat under his usual tree, a fig tree, old and wide, with roots that reached into the ground like fingers that had given up trying to pull themselves free, and he opened the cloth he kept his midday meal in. 2 pieces of flatbread, a small portion of rice, a few pieces of dried mango. He ate slowly. The river made its sound. Here is what the cowherd did not yet know. 3 days' walk to the north, along this same river, a man was preparing to stand up after sitting for a very long time. He had been sitting under a different kind of tree, a peepal tree, wide and breathing, older than the village it stood near, and the sitting had lasted longer than anyone expected. The man's name was Siddhartha, but that name was already beginning to fade, the way names do when they are replaced by something larger. What he had just understood, in the hours before this dawn, in the stillness that falls just before the sky begins to lighten, what he had understood was something that no language had the right shape for, something about suffering, about its cause, about the fact that the cause could be released, about the path that led to that release, something about dukkha and what came after it. The sun climbed higher. Nanda's cows grazed. Mala, the old brown one, came and stood close to him the way she always did in the early afternoon, not asking for anything, just being near. He rested his hand on her warm flank. He felt her breathing on. And without knowing any of what was coming, without knowing about the man by the peepal tree, without knowing what the yellow cloth meant, without knowing that his own name would someday be remembered by people he could not have imagined, Nanda sat in the shade of his fig tree on the eastern slope above the river bend and breathed. The world held him. He did not know yet that it always had. Tonight, let the river run in the background of whatever you are carrying. Let the mist be thick on the water. Let it be enough for now, just to be here. We will follow Nanda further tomorrow. But for now, he counts his cows, all 21, and tucks the yellow cloth a little closer to his chest, and the morning moves on. By now you have walked with Nanda to the eastern pasture. You have felt the morning mist on his river. But that same river, further north, on a morning not so different from this one, was the setting for something else entirely, something that had already happened before this story began, and whose ripples were still moving south. Let me take you there for a little while. Her name was Sujata. She was young, 17, perhaps 18, the daughter of a landowner in the village of Senani, which sat near the banks of the Niranjana River, not far from a great peepal tree that the villagers had been making offerings under for as long as anyone could remember. The tree was old enough that no one knew how old it was, and its roots had broken through the earth in every direction, as if the tree had decided long ago that it needed to hold more of the world than other trees do. Every year Sujata would come to this tree and make a vow, and every year the vow was answered. She had prayed for a good husband, she found one. She had prayed for a son came. So that morning she rose before the birds and prepared her offering, milk rice, the finest kind, a kind that takes all morning to make, stirring slowly, adding the milk in stages, waiting for the right consistency, the right smell, the right color, the kind her mother had taught her to make and her mother's mother before that. She poured it into a golden bowl, and here is a detail easy to walk right past. When Sujata arrived at the pipal tree that morning with her golden bowl of milk rice, she found a man sitting beneath it. Not expected anyone to be there. He was thin, thinner than anyone she had ever seen who was still alive. His ribs showed through his skin. His face was the face of someone who had been very far away for a very long time and had only just begun the journey back. He was sitting completely still. His eyes were open, and yet he did not look like a man who was seeing the tree or the river or the early morning sky above the water. He looked like a man who was seeing something else entirely. Something that did not require eyes. Sujata stopped walking. She was not afraid. That was the strange thing. Later, she would think about this many times, and she could never explain it. She had every reason to be startled by this stranger under her tree, but she felt instead something she could only describe as recognition, as if some part of her had known he would be there. She walked forward, she knelt, she held out the golden bowl. The man looked at her, and when his eyes focused on her, really focused, the way eyes do when they come back from wherever they have been, he smiled. It was not a grand smile, not the smile of a king or a teacher or a man who knows he has just understood something no one else has understood. It was a very simple smile, the smile of a man who has been hungry for a long time and has just been offered something to eat. He took the bowl with both hands. The gesture was careful, deliberate. The way you hold something when you understand that the giving of it meant something to the person who gave it. He ate slowly, and Sujata walked home. Let me stay with Sujata for a moment longer, because her story is usually told quickly as a preamble to the greater story, and in the telling quickly, something is lost. She went home and she did her ordinary things. She ground the spices, she fed the fire, she swept the courtyard with the palm broom her mother had left her. She did all of this, and the quality of the doing was different. Not because something magical had happened, because she had given something away without reservation, and the giving had not diminished her. This is what dana actually feels like, not the performance of it, not the calculated giving where you release a thing and wait to see what returns. The real kind, the kind where you hold out what you have and the holding out is itself complete, regardless of what happens after. She did not know that morning that the bowl she had handed to a thin man by a pipal tree would be mentioned in texts read thousands of years later in languages she could not have imagined. She only knew the courtyard, the broom, the smell of the cooking fire, and the cleanness inside her hands where she had let something go. That is the whole teaching on dana if you want the short version. The cleanness inside the hands where you have let something go. She did not know his name. She did not know that he had been sitting under that tree, on and off, for days. That he had tried everything before this, extreme fasting, breath control. Every kind of physical discipline the seekers of that time knew how to attempt, and had found that none of it led where he thought it would lead. None. She did not know that the meal she had just prepared would be the last meal he ate before the night that changed everything. She only knew that when she walked home that morning, the bowl she had brought was empty, and she felt, not for some reason she could not name, that her vow had been heard. The word for what she had done, the act of giving without expectation, of placing something in another person's hands and asking for nothing back, is dana. Dana is usually translated as generosity, but generosity sounds like a virtue, something you work at, something you practice in order to become better. Dana is something slightly different. Dana is what happens when the distance between you and another person disappears for a moment, when you see that their hunger is your hunger, that their need is not separate from you. Sujata did not perform generosity that morning. She simply closed a distance. and the closing of that distance set something in motion that is still moving now. 3 days' walk to the south, Nanda was driving his cows back from the eastern pasture as the afternoon light began to soften and go golden. He stopped. On the road ahead, not the main road, a smaller path that ran alongside the river, there were people, not many, 5, perhaps 6, walking slowly in a loose group, not in a hurry. Several of them had shaved heads. They were wearing cloth the color of the garment Nanda carried folded against his chest, yellow, the color of turmeric, not the color of late afternoon. In the middle of the group, slightly ahead, walked a man. Nanda was too far away to see his face. He was too far away to hear what anyone was saying, and he could only see the shape of the man. The way he held himself, neither stiff nor slouched, simply upright in the way a tree is upright, not working at it, just placed. Nanda stood very still. His cows kept walking, and Mala brushed past his hand. He barely noticed. He watched the group until they disappeared around a bend in the river path. Then he stood there for a little longer. He could have walked after them. The path was open. His cows knew the way home. He could have followed. He did not. He didn't know why. He turned his cows toward the village and walked home with the yellow cloth still folded against his chest. But he thought about that upright man. He thought about him for the rest of the evening, through supper, which was rice and lentils, the same as every evening. Through the slow time afterward when the lamps were lit and the children of his neighbor played outside in the last of the light. And through the long quiet of the night when the river sounds drifted in through the walls and the cows breathed in the dark and Mala, somewhere in the herd, shifted her weight and sighed. He thought about the way the man walked. He had seen people walk that way before. No, that was not quite right. He had never seen anyone walk exactly that way. He had seen people walk with purpose, with urgency, with the particular forward lean of someone who needed to be somewhere. He had seen people walk with weariness, with the slow, careful steps of those carrying more than their bodies. This was different. This was a man walking the way the river moved, without effort, without urgency, without seeming to need the walking to end anywhere in particular. Nanda lay down on his mat. He placed his hand on the cloth in the dark. The fabric was cool. He fell asleep. But before he did, there was a period, the way there always is before sleep, a threshold time, a time that belongs neither to the day nor to the night. When thoughts move through him the way water moves through loose earth, he thought about the man on the road, and he thought about the way a group of people walking together can feel different from a single person walking, how a group usually pulls something behind it, noise or urgency or the particular gravity of collective purpose, how this group had felt different, lighter, as if they were not pulling anything, as if they were simply moving through the world without adding weight to it. He had met, in his 40 years, 2 kinds of travelers. None. The ones who were going somewhere important, who carried the importance of it in their posture and their speed, and the ones who were going home, which had its own quality, the loosening quality, the permission to be whatever you actually were because the audience had been left behind. This group had felt like neither. They had felt like something he did not have a word for, like people who had somehow resolved the difference between the two, who moved through the world with the ease of going home, even though home for them was nowhere fixed, who had found inside the movement itself some quality of arrival. He turned this over. Outside, the village settled into its night sounds, dogs at the far end of the lane, the river always. Somewhere a child cried once and then did not. He thought, what would it be like to walk that way? He could not imagine it from inside his ordinary walking. His walking was always toward something or away from something. It was functional. It was the walking of a man with animals and fields and a fence post that needed fixing. What would it mean to walk as if the walking itself were the destination? He did not find an answer. He was asleep before he finished the question. But the question stayed, the way questions do sometimes, not in the mind exactly, but in the body, in the particular quality of rest that followed, something slightly different in the dark behind his eyes than the night before. as if something had been planted, and as if some part of him, the part that does not require the mind's permission, had already begun quietly to grow. And on the path along the river, 3 days' walk to the north, a man who had just eaten for the first time in many days sat down beneath a pipal tree as the last light left the sky. He would not get up until something very large had been understood. Tomorrow the stars would still be out, and the real work would begin. Let the river carry your thoughts now. Let the yellow light of that long ego morning settle around you. You have been carrying something today too, something you might not have a name for. Something that sits just under the ordinary surface of things, like the river current that runs deep below the part of the river you can see. It has a name if you want one, but the name can wait. For now, let yourself be held the way the river holds its banks. Not tightly, not permanently, just for this moment, just enough. You are still by the river. The mist is clearing now. The morning is becoming itself. Not. But before we follow Nanda further south, there is one more piece of this story that needs to be placed, because nothing that happens next will make complete sense without it. And this piece involves a king. His name was Bimbisara. He was the king of Magadha, which was at that time one of the most powerful kingdoms in the great plain of northern India. He had armies, he had advisors. He had wives and children and more rooms in his palace than he could visit in a week. He had, by any ordinary measure, everything. And he had, this is the important part, a quality that kings often lack, which is the ability to look at someone with nothing and recognize that they might know something he does not. This quality would define the rest of his life. The story begins on a hillside outside the city of Rajagaha, which was Bimbisara's capital. He was watching from his palace window when his advisors came to him and said, "There is a young man walking in the streets, a mendicant, a seeker, but not the ordinary kind." People were stopping to watch him walk. This was unusual enough that Bimbisara put down whatever he had been doing and went to the window. And even from that distance, even seeing only the shape of a young man walking through the lower city, Bimbisara felt something. He did not tell his advisors what he felt. A king cannot always say what he feels. But he sent men ahead to find out where the young man was going, and then he went himself. He found Siddhartha on the slope of Pandava Hill, sitting in the shade of a rock, eating his midday meal with the particular focused calm of someone who has learned to make eating into a kind of meditation. Bimbisara climbed the hill. He sat across from the young man. He looked at him for a long moment, and then he asked what kings always ask when they do not know what else to ask. He said, "What do you want?" Meaning, what can I give you? What title? What land? What army? What resource? I am a king. I can give things. Tell me what you want, and I will provide it, and then you will owe me something, and the world will make sense again. And here is where the story turns quiet. Siddhartha looked at him. He did not answer right away. He set down his bowl. He looked at the king the way you look at something you are trying to understand fully before you respond to it. Then he said, "I am looking for something that cannot be given." Bimbisara frowned. He was a practical man. He believed in things that could be given. That was rather the point of being a king. He said, "Everything can be given if the giver has enough." Siddhartha shook his head, not unkindly. The way you shake your head at a child who has made a reasonable but incorrect assumption. He said, "What I am looking for is the end of suffering, not the reduction of it, not the management of it, the end. That cannot be given by any king. It can only be found." Bimbisara sat with that for a while. The city hummed below them. Someone was selling something in a language that carried, but not clearly enough to make out words. A bird crossed the sky above the hill. Then Bimbisara asked, and this was the better question, the question underneath the first question. He said, "Have you found it yet?" "No," said Siddhartha, "not yet." Bimbisara nodded. He said, "And if you do, come back and teach me." Siddhartha said he would. He kept that promise. But that is a different chapter. What matters here is what the exchange planted in the soil of the story. A king looked at a man with nothing and asked to learn from him. A man with nothing looked at a king and told him the truth, and Bimbisara walked back down the hill carrying a question he had never thought to ask before. Not what can I give, but what cannot be given. Bimbisara carried his question through the gate of the city. People moved aside for him, not because they were afraid exactly, but because kings carry a kind of pressure with them, a weight of presence that rearranges the people around them without anyone deciding to be rearranged. He barely noticed. He was thinking about the young man on the hill. He was thinking about the way the young man had looked at him, not up, in the way people look at kings, tilted back, slightly expectant, waiting for permission, and not down, in the way of people who resent power and express it through the small rebellion of looking elsewhere. He had looked straight across, as if the king and the seeker were at exactly the same height. Bimbisara had not been looked at that way in a very long time, possibly ever. When you are a king from birth, the looking straight across is so rare you do not recognize it immediately. You have to let it settle before you understand what it was, he thought. That was what it feels like to be seen without rank. He turned it over. It was not comfortable, exactly. Something in him that was very old, something that had been built up over years of being treated as a king, of having people arrange themselves around him. That thing had been slightly disturbed, and underneath the disturbance, something else, something that felt like relief. The word for what Siddhartha offered Bimbisara in that conversation, what he offered every person he ever sat across from, every village and palace and forest clearing, was metta. And metta deserves to be held for a moment before we move on. Because it is easy to translate metta as loving kindness and then to understand loving kindness as a feeling, a warm feeling. The feeling you have toward people you already love applied now with some effort to people you do not love yet. That is not quite it. Metta is not a feeling that you generate toward others. It is a recognition that you extend toward others. The recognition that they, like you, wake up in the morning and would prefer the day to go well. That they, like you, carry something they have not fully put down. That they, like you, have buried somewhere under the accumulated weight of the years. A simple original wish, to be well, to be free from suffering, to find the day adequate to what the day requires. Every person, not just the ones who are easy to love, the king on the hill, the man in the charnel ground, the person on the road who is walking too slowly. The person whose face has the particular closed quality of someone who has been hurt and has decided, reasonably, not to be open to more of it. Metta says, underneath all of that, the protection, the guardedness, the strategies of self-preservation, underneath all of it, the same original wish. And when you see it in another person, you cannot be completely separate from them. That is metta, not a feeling. A seeing, not a doctrine, not a teaching, not a prescription, but something more like a direction, a pointing toward, is metta. It is usually translated as loving kindness. But metta is older than kindness, deeper than love as the word is usually used. Metta is the wish, held in the body as much as the mind, that another being be free from suffering, that another being be well, that another being be happy in the truest sense of the word, not distracted, not numbed, not entertained into forgetting, but genuinely, fundamentally okay. When Bimbisara walked down that hill, something in him had been seen, not his rank or his army or his wealth. He had been seen as a being who suffered, and who did not want to suffer, who deserved, like all beings, the chance to find the end of it. That seeing was metta. He did not know what to do with it yet, but it changed the way he walked. 3 days south, a village with no name that anyone outside it would remember. A man named Nanda was hearing stories about the wandering teacher. He heard them the way news travels in villages, in fragments, in bits and pieces, arriving through different mouths with slightly different details that you have to hold together yourself and make into something coherent. He heard that the teacher had been a prince, that he had given up the palace, that he had sat under a tree for a very long time, and when he stood up he was different. He heard that the teacher would speak to anyone, that he had spoken to outcasts and kings in the same week, that he did not seem to find one more interesting than the other. Nanda listened. He did not say anything. This was usual for him. He had grown up in a house where speaking in groups was not something that happened naturally. His father had been a quiet man. His mother had been a quiet woman. The house he grew up in was full of the particular industry of people who understood their lives as something to be done, not discussed. He had inherited this. But he was listening. The men around the fire were arguing, not aggressively, in the way of men who enjoy the texture of an argument more than its resolution, about whether the wandering teacher was a holy man or simply a man who had decided not to work. One man said, "My cousin saw him in Rajagaha." He said the man sat in the street and answered questions for hours, anyone who came. He said there was a line. Another said, "Any man who refuses to grow his own food is a burden on those who do." The first man said, "The monks receive alms. That is not the same as refusing to work. The almsgiving is a practice for the giver as much as the gift for the receiver." The second man said, "That is a very convenient teaching for someone who does not want to plant rice." Laughter, the laughter of men who are not entirely sure which side they are on. A third man, older, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived enough to have earned his opinions, said, "I heard that he was a prince, that he had palaces and armies waiting for him, and he walked away from all of it." Silence. Because a man who walks away from palaces and armies is a different kind of man from a man who simply does not want to work. Nanda turned this over. He thought about what it would mean to walk away from palaces and armies, and he could not quite imagine it. His entire life had been a project of accumulation towards sufficiency, of getting enough so that enough was not always the question. The idea of turning away from abundance was, from inside his life, almost incomprehensible. And yet, he thought about the man on the path, about the quality of the walking. He thought, whatever that man has or has not walked away from, he has found something, he thought. I would like to know what it is. He did not say this aloud, but he sat with it beside the fire while the argument continued around him. And later, driving his cows home in the last of the light, he thought about what it would mean to want the right thing, to have the direction of the wanting pointed somewhere true. The stars came out. He counted his cows, 21, still there, still his, still enough. And he was not the kind of man who said things in groups, but later alone, driving his cows to water in the last hour before dark, he thought about what it meant to speak to anyone. He tried to imagine a man who would look at him, Nanda, with his muddy feet and his mended sandals and his 21 cows, and not immediately find something else to look at. He could not quite imagine it, but something in him wanted to. Tonight, somewhere in the world you live in, there is someone sitting at the end of a long day feeling exactly what Nanda felt. They have done their work. They have counted their cows, whatever form those cows take, the hours, the tasks, the small, reliable things that structure a life. They have come home, they have eaten, and in the quiet, something in them is restless, not unhappy exactly, not broken, just reaching for something without knowing quite what they are reaching for. The Pali word for that reaching is dukkha, and the teaching that addresses it is not about fixing anything. It is about learning to see the reaching clearly, and in the seeing, the naming, the honest looking, something begins to loosen, very slowly, the way the first light loosens the darkness. You don't need to do anything with that tonight. Just notice, if something in you is reaching right now, let it reach. We will follow it together. If you are still awake, you might leave a thought below about what the reaching feels like for you. What does the quiet restlessness at the end of a good day sound like when you stop moving long enough to hear it? I would genuinely like to know. But for now, let the river run. Let Nanda's cows drink their fill. Let the king walk down his hill with his new question. And let yourself rest inside this story for a little longer. By now you've walked with Nanda along the river, watched him see the yellow-robed figures from a distance, and heard the fragments of a story that were reaching him from upstream. But Nanda had not yet walked close. That was about to change. It happened on a morning after rain. Night before had been a heavy one, the kind of monsoon rain that is less like weather and more like a decision the sky has made, a kind that comes in sideways and fills every low place in the earth with dark water that smells of clay and roots and old things waking up. By morning, the path along the river was soft, the grass was bent, the air was the particular shade of fresh that only exists in the hour after rain, before anything has dried, before the sun has burned the wet away. Nanda was taking his cows to the lower pasture. He was not thinking about the teacher. He was thinking about Mala, who had been eating less than usual, whose eyes had been looking inward in that animal way that can mean illness or simply age or simply a morning of quietness. And there they were, not down the path this time, not disappearing around a bend, right here, on this path, coming toward him, 5 monks walking single file in the easy, unhurried way of people who have nowhere to be by a particular time. Behind them, slightly apart, the man Nanda had seen from across the field 2 weeks before. Not a face he recognized, and a presence he recognized. There is a detail here easy to miss. The monks walked around Nanda's cows without breaking stride, stepping to the side of the path with the matter-of-fact grace of people accustomed to sharing the road with everything that lives. They did not glance at Nanda. Or rather, they glanced and then their eyes moved on, the way eyes do when they are at rest and have no need to hold anything. But the man at the back, the one who walked slightly apart, stopped. He stopped and looked at the cows, not the way a person looks at cows to assess them or to count them or to determine their usefulness. He looked at them the way you look at something that is simply entirely itself. Then he looked at Nanda. Nanda stopped breathing. He would not be able to explain this later, and later he would try many times. He would describe it to his neighbor's wife, who was the best listener he knew, and he would describe it to the man who came to buy one of his cows the following spring. He would try to find the words, and the words would always fall short. The man looked at Nanda, and Nanda felt, for the span of perhaps 3 breaths, entirely seen, not judged, not assessed, not found wanting or found sufficient, seen the way the river sees the stones at its bottom, without commentary, without the need for the stones to be different from what they are. Man said, "How many cows do you have today?" Nanda said, 21. The man nodded, as if 21 were exactly the right number, as if the number mattered not because of its monetary value, but because it was the true answer. And this is where Nanda's version of the story always paused, because even years later he could not quite believe he had done it. Nanda asked a question. He said, "Forgive me, but can someone like me, can someone who cannot read, who has no teacher, who has only cows and a field that floods, can someone like me learn?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a cup being held very carefully, waiting to be filled. The man said, "The Dharma does not go to the palace first and come to the field later. It goes wherever there is a mind willing to look." Nanda said, "I don't know how to look." The man said, "You are already doing it." You stopped and asked. "That is the beginning," he said. "Your cows, do they know the way to the river?" Nanda said, "Yes, they have always known." He said, "And did you teach them, or did they find it because they were thirsty?" Nanda thought about this. He said, "I suppose they found it themselves." The man smiled. He said, "Truth works the same way." And then he nodded and walked on down the path after his monks, unhurried, stepping lightly over a root that crossed the path, until the bend in the river took him. Nanda stood there with his 21 cows. Mala pressed her warm head against his shoulder. He put his hand up and rested it between her ears without thinking. The word the man had used, Dhamma, Nanda did not fully understand it that morning. He would come to understand it slowly, the way you come to understand a river, not all at once, not by standing on the bank and studying it, but by spending time near it, letting it teach you through proximity. Dhamma in Pali means several things at once. The way important words usually do means the teaching. The words the Buddha spoke, the lessons he offered, the maps he drew with language for the territory of the mind. It also means the truth those teachings point toward, the underlying order of things, the way things actually are when you stop trying to make them different from what they are. And it means something more like natural law. The way a river flows downhill not because it was told to, but because that is the nature of rivers and of gravity and of the particular world we find ourselves in. The Dhamma was not invented, it was noticed. Around this same time, a week's walk away, in the deer park outside the city of Varanasi, which the people of that time called the Isapatana, the place where the seers descend. Something was happening that would change the way the Dhamma moved through the world. Moment. 5 men were sitting in the park. They had known Siddhartha before. They had been his companions during the years of extreme asceticism, the years of fasting, the years of breath control and physical discipline. They had followed him because they believed in what he was attempting. When he gave it up, when he accepted food from Sujata's golden bowl and sat down under the pipal tree to rest, they had been disappointed. They had left. They were sitting in the deer park, still trying, in their own way, to find what they were looking for. When a figure appeared at the edge of the park, walking in that particular way, they recognized him, and they had decided among themselves that they would not rise to greet him, that they would treat him as an equal, not a teacher, because a teacher who ate rice porridge and abandoned his practice had forfeited the right to teach. In their view, that was the plan. But when he was close enough that they could see his face, something in them responded before their plan could catch up. They rose, they washed his feet, they brought water, they prepared a seat. This gesture, washing the feet of someone who has just arrived, carries, in the context of that time and place, a specific weight. It was an act of hospitality, yes, but it was also an act of positioning. It said, I receive you. I recognize that you have traveled. I honor the fact of your arrival with my hands. 5 men who had decided not to honor him had, without deciding, honored him. Because the body knows things the plan does not, he sat, let them prepare the seat. He let them pour the water. He let their hands perform their old habitual hospitality, the one they had learned long before they became seekers, back when they were sons in households with mothers who had taught them how to receive a guest. He did not hurry them. He understood, and this is something the texts return to again and again in different stories. With different characters, he understood that the receiving was part of the giving. That if you did not let someone offer you something, you denied them the opening of the hand, the cleanness inside the hand, the thing Sujata had felt walking back from the pipal tree that morning. He let them give, and then he gave back. He said, listen carefully. They washed his feet. They brought water. They prepared a seat. They brought him water. They prepared a seat. Later, none of them could fully explain why. They rose because of something they felt in the body before the mind had time to intercept it. This is worth staying with, not because we live in a time, and perhaps all times have been this time, in different ways, when we trust the mind more than the body. When we believe that valid knowledge is the kind that can be stated, argued, checked on. When we discount what the body knows on the grounds that the body is not reliable, that it can be fooled, that it reacts to things we have not verified. But the 5 monks rose before their minds could generate an objection, and the thing they rose toward was real. The teacher had walked through the fire of everything that could be walked through, and the walking had left a quality in him that the body of another person could detect the way a compass detects north. Not because the compass thinks about it, but because that is what compasses are built to do. We are built to detect something in each other. We just do not always trust what we detect. The 5 monks trusted it. They rose. They only said, he was different, something in him was different from when we last saw him. He sat, he looked at them. He said, listen carefully, I have something to tell you. And what he told them, the first formal teaching, the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dhammacakkappavattana. What he told them was not complicated. He said, there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, the cause can end. Here is the path to that ending. That is all. That is the whole of it. Its simplest form. The man who heard this first, the one whose eyes went wide and whose breath changed, his name was Kandana. He sat very still, and then he said quietly, whatever has the nature of arising has the nature of ceasing. The teacher looked at him and said, Kandana understands. Kandana understands. It was the first moment of the teaching passing from one person to another. The deer in the park that morning did not leave. This is a detail that the old texts mention in passing, almost as an aside. When the teaching began, when the teacher sat before the 5 monks in the deer park and began to speak, the deer that lived in the park came and sat at the edge of the gathering, not moving, not eating, listening. And whether this is literally what happened, or whether it is the story's way of saying something true in the language of symbol, it does not matter for what it is pointing at. What it points at is this: the teaching was not exclusive. It was not addressed only to humans. It was not addressed only to the educated. It was not addressed only to those who could follow the argument. It was addressed to whatever was present and willing to be still. In the old texts, the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma is sometimes called the Dhammacakkappavattana, a word that contains within it the image of a wheel set in motion. Not a wheel that reaches a destination and stops, a wheel that once turned and continues. It is still turning. You are here tonight because it is still turning. The wheel had begun to turn. In the village to the south, Nanda drove his cows to water and thought about what the man on the path had said. Truth works the same way. He turned it over the way he turned everything over, slowly, with the particular patience of a man who does not have anyone to rush him through his thinking. He had always been like this, even as a boy. The thoughts took time. He was not slow in the way of someone who struggles. He was slow in the way of someone who knows that quick conclusions are usually the wrong ones. The cows drank. The river made its sound. He thought about the question the man had asked, about the cows knowing the way to the river. He had said, "Did you teach them, or did they find it because they were thirsty?" He thought. "I did not teach them," he thought, "yet they know." He thought about what it would mean to be thirsty for the truth in the way a cow is thirsty for water. Not philosophically thirsty, not the intellectual kind of thirst that enjoys the question more than the answer, a physical kind, the kind that has the body involved, that makes you move toward the thing whether or not you have decided to move. Was he thirsty like that? He stood beside the river and tried to locate the thirst in his body. It was there. He was surprised to find it, but it was there, not in the chest, not in the throat, but somewhere lower, somewhere more central, a kind of pull that had been operating for a long time without his awareness. Since before the yellow cloth, since before the man on the path, since before the conversation about the king and the hill, perhaps since much longer. And perhaps since the first morning he had stood at the river counting his cows and felt that something was not quite right. Not wrong, not broken, just not quite right, and had no word for it. Dukkha. He had a word for it now, and somewhere in the having of the word, the thirst became more visible. He watched Mala drink. Long, slow pulls, eyes half closed. She did not doubt that the water was there. She was simply thirsty. She drank, he thought. Maybe that is the only instruction I need. He watched Mala drink, long, slow pulls of river water. Her eyes half closed, he thought. She does not worry about whether she deserves the water. She is thirsty. She drinks. The rest of the herd gathered around. The river made its sound. The afternoon light moved across the surface of the water in that slow golden way it has when the day is turning. Nanda did not know what to do with what had just happened to him, so he did what he always did. He stayed close to his cows and waited to see what the next morning would bring. The rains came hard that year. Not unusually hard, not the kind of flooding that becomes a story people tell for generations, just the steady, insistent monsoon rain that arrives every year and changes everything for a few months. The paths turned to rivers, the rivers turned to something wider. The lower pasture, where the grass was sweetest, stayed underwater for the better part of 6 weeks. Nanda moved his herd to the higher ground. He spent those weeks building a makeshift shelter out of bamboo and palm leaves for the oldest cows, the ones whose bones ached in the wet. He did this without being asked, without anyone watching, the way he did most things. This was the texture of his care, private, practical, without an audience and without requiring one. He had never thought of this as a virtue, had thought of it as simply what you did when you were the one who was there and you could see what was needed. Virtue, in his understanding, was something other people talked about, something discussed in the places where people discussed things, which was not his field, not his pasture, not his cold January mornings, pulling calves into the world with no one watching. Ananda had said, "You give from where you are, with what you have." He thought about that now, nailing a palm leaf more securely over the oldest cow's sleeping spot. He was giving from where he was. He had always been giving from where he was. He had just not known it counted. It was in the 3rd week of the rains that Mala stopped eating. Not suddenly, it was gradual, the way these things are gradual, and a little less interest in the morning grass. A little more time standing apart from the herd, looking at the middle distance with those patient animal eyes. A slight stiffness in the morning that did not ease through the day. Nanda noticed each of these things. He did not say anything to his neighbor, who was the closest thing he had to a friend. He did not say anything to anyone. He simply watched, the way he always watched, the way 20 years of tending animals teaches you to watch, with a quality of attention that is not anxious and not detached, but something in between, something that is simply present with what is there. Then, on a morning in the 4th week of the rains, he counted his cows. 20. He counted again, carefully, name by name. 20. Mala was not there. He spent the morning looking. He walked every path she might have taken. He called her name in the low voice he used when he did not want to startle the others. He checked the river bend, the shade of the old fig tree, the edge of the forest where she sometimes stood and looked at the trees as if she were remembering something from very long ago. She was nowhere. By midday, he understood. He sat down under the fig tree. Here is what surprised him. Then, he had loved Mala. That was not a dramatic statement. It was simply true. In the way that you love things you have cared for, things that have trusted you, things that have rested their weight against you on cold mornings. He had loved her with the particular love that does not make speeches and does not perform itself, that simply exists in the daily act of tending, and yet he was not, he found, crying. He was not broken in the way he would have predicted. He sat under the fig tree and he searched for the word, and the word was not grief, not exactly. It was something more like recognition. As if he had always known, somewhere in his body, that Mala would not be there forever. As if his body had been quietly preparing for this moment for a long time without telling his mind. He sat with that strange not grief for a long time. His remaining 20 cows grazed around him, unbothered, doing what cows do, which is simply to be present with the grass and the light and the smell of wet earth. He envied them a little. He had grown up in a village where men did not say the word grief. They said, it was his time. They said, at least it was quick. They said, these things happen. These were not wrong statements. They were true statements, all of them. But they were said in a way that moved quickly past the thing instead of standing in it long enough to let it be real. Nanda had learned, without being taught, to move quickly past things. He was good at it. He had moved quickly past the death of his father, which had happened when he was 12 and had left him the man of the field by default. not by choice, by simple arithmetic. He had moved quickly past the years that followed, the hard years, the lean years, the years when the math of surviving barely balanced out. He had built a practice, without knowing he was building one, of not standing still long enough for the grief to find him, and now here he was, standing still, because Mala was gone, and the grief had found him. And it was not what he had expected. It was not the drowning he had always braced for. It was quieter. It was the river after the flood, when the water has receded and left everything clean and a little raw and more itself than before. He sat with that. Not he, let it be what it was. That evening he passed near the road where, in those months, the monks and their teacher had been passing regularly on their way between the villages where they received alms. He did not go looking on. He was just walking with his cows on his path. But Ananda was sitting on a stone by the road, just outside the usual flow of foot traffic, sewing something, mending a robe, his head bent over the work, a posture of complete absorption in a small task. Nanda stopped. He said, "Excuse me." Ananda looked up. He had a round face and eyes that were, without effort, warm. He was the kind of person whose attention, when it turned to you, made you feel that you had been seen and not found lacking, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. Nanda said, "I lost a cow today. I have had her for 11 years, and I find that I don't know what I am." Nanda set down his sewing. He said, "Tell me about her." So Nanda told him. About Mala, about the ring of dark fur, about the way she knew when thunder was coming, about the cold January mornings and the weight of her head on his shoulder. Ananda listened, not with the listening of someone waiting to respond, the real kind. When Nanda was finished, Ananda said, "You expected to feel differently than you do." Nanda said, "I expected to feel worse." Ananda was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The teacher would say that your body understood something your mind had not yet caught up with." Nanda said, "What would he say about that?" Ananda said, "He would say Anicca." And then, because Nanda's face did not show recognition, he said, "It is a word that means impermanence, the nature of all things that arise to also pass." Your body knew that Mala would not be there forever. Your body has known this since she was born. And in that knowing, even without words, there is something that looks like peace when the thing finally ends. And because the ending was already always part of the nature of the thing. Nanda thought about this. He said, "But that sounds like not allowing yourself to love anything." And Ananda said quickly, with more heat than his usual gentle manner, as if this were something he felt strongly about. He said, "No, the teacher does not say, 'Do not love.' He says, 'Love without clinging.' Let the cow be a cow, not a guarantee. Let the 11 years be 11 years, not a debt you are owed. Love what is here while it is here, and let it be what it is, which is here now, gone later. The love does not become smaller, it becomes more honest." Nanda was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need to think about that." Ananda said, "Good. Thinking about it is the right response." Nanda walked on home. The word Anicca rode with him. Impermanence, nature of arising and ceasing. The truth that every morning's count might be different from the evening's. He thought about the yellow cloth he carried. He thought about how long it had been folded against his chest. He wondered, and for the first time, whether it too was impermanent, whether it would one day simply return to wherever it had come from. That evening there was a woman in the village who had come from further north. Her name was Mahapajapati Gotami, and she was not from their village. She was passing through, accompanied by several other women in similar gray-white robes, traveling in a group with the quiet purposefulness of people who know where they are going and are not troubled by how long the road is. Someone said she had been the teacher's aunt, his foster mother. Actually, the woman who had raised him after his birth mother died, that she had become one of the first women to receive ordination in the Sangha. Nanda did not speak to her. He watched her from across the courtyard where the travelers stopped to rest. She was not young. Her face had the quality of a face that had held many expressions over many years. and had arrived at something close to stillness. Not the stillness of someone who has given up, the stillness of someone who has set down a very heavy thing and found that the floor holds them fine without it. She was speaking to a younger woman who had been crying. Nanda could not hear the words, but he could see the quality of her attention. The way she leaned slightly toward the younger woman, not invading her space, not performing comfort, just closer, present. He thought about Ananda saying, "Love without clinging." He thought perhaps that was what it looked like. Not a diminished love, a more honest one. The rains continued. Every morning for the rest of that monsoon, Nanda counted 20 cows. He did not replace Mala. He did not stop thinking about her, but the counting was still a prayer. Even with one fewer name, maybe especially with one fewer name. Perhaps tonight you are carrying something that is one fewer than it used to be. A person, a certainty, a version of yourself you have outgrown without meaning to. Let the empty space be there. You do not have to fill it tonight. The word is Anicca. And the thing that is impermanent includes the grief itself. If you are walking through something difficult right now, share it below. Not to perform it, just to let it exist somewhere outside your chest for a moment. We will keep walking. The rains ended. They always end. That is one of the things the rains teach. And if you are paying attention, that the thing which seems like it will go on forever does not. The paths dried. The river settled back into its banks. The lower pasture came back, green and lush, and smelling of everything that had been underwater and was now finding the sun again. Nanda brought his 20 cows down from the high ground. He counted them. 20, still. Pay close attention to what happens next. In the weeks after the rains, the teacher and his monks had taken up residence near a mango grove on the edge of a large town 2 days' walk to the north. This was not unusual during the rains. It was traditional for wandering teachers and their students to stop traveling and stay in one place. Many people from across the region had come to the grove to listen and to ask questions and to decide for themselves what they thought. The grove had been given by a man named Anathapindika. He was a merchant and wealthy enough that the scale of his wealth had long since stopped being something he thought about. It had become, instead, a kind of medium he moved through, the way a fish moves through water without noticing it. And he had heard about the teacher while he was on a business trip to Rajagaha, King Bimbisara's capital. He had gone not out of spiritual seeking, particularly, but out of the same practical curiosity that made him a successful merchant. When many people are talking about the same thing, it is useful to go and look at it yourself. He sat and listened. He went back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third morning, he came to a decision. He was going to build a place for the teacher and his monks, not because he had been asked to, not because it was expected of him, or because it would bring him prestige, though it would, and he knew this, and the knowing did not embarrass him the way it might have embarrassed someone who had not yet made peace with the complexity of his own motivations. He had given to many things in his life. Some of the giving had been the giving of a man who wanted to be seen giving, the giving of a man who understood that generosity was also a form of currency, that it purchased things, reputation, goodwill, the kind of social warmth that greases the machinery of commerce. He was clear-eyed about this. He had been in trade long enough to be clear-eyed about most things, but this was different. He sat with the difference and tried to understand it. The closest he could come was this. Usually when he gave, some part of him waited to see what returned, not the coin. He was past the crudeness of expecting exact reciprocity, but something. The feeling of having placed a stone in the correct position, the slight satisfaction of an account balanced. This time, nothing in him was waiting. He wanted to give the place not because of what would come from giving it, but because the giving itself, the act of making a permanent space for this teaching in the world, felt like the most real use of whatever he had accumulated. Like every coin he had ever earned had been, without his knowing, moving toward this purpose. He was going to build a place for the teacher and his monks, not a temporary camp, a proper residence. a place with walls and roofs, where the teaching could happen out of the rain, where people could come and know they would find the Sangha. He went home and began looking for land. The story goes, and this story is told with relish in several of the old texts because it involves what merchants enjoy, which is a negotiation. He found the perfect piece of land. It belonged to a prince. The prince did not want to sell, so Anathapindika made an offer. He said, "I will buy this land at whatever price you name." The prince said, "I would only sell if you could cover every inch of the ground with gold coins." Anathapindika said, "Done." He meant it literally. He went home and came back with carts full of gold and began laying coins on the ground, edge to edge, covering the earth of the prince's park with gold. The prince, watching this, realized he had made his joke into an actual price, and that this man was paying it. He was so struck by this, by the quality of devotion it represented, that he said, "Keep your gold, give me the grove. We will share the merit of this place." And so the Jetavana monastery was built. Nanda heard about this. He heard, in his village, the way you hear things, fragments arriving through travelers and traders. He heard that a merchant had bought a park with gold coins. He heard that there was a monastery now, a real one with walls. He stood in his field and thought about what it would take for him to give like that. He had 20 cows. That was everything he had. He could not imagine giving it away. He thought about Dana. He thought about the golden bowl that Sujata had held out to a thin man under a tree. He thought about the fact that she was not a merchant. She was a farmer's daughter with a golden bowl and milk rice she had made with her own hands. Giving had mattered just as much. Maybe it was not the amount. Maybe the point was what happened inside you when you gave. Whether the giving was clean, whether the hand that offered was open or slightly, secretly holding on. He did not have an answer, but he had a question. That was, as someone had recently told him, the beginning. There was another story circulating in those days that Nanda heard in pieces from different mouths that he spent some time turning over. It was the story of a man named Upali. Upali had been a barber. This was, at that time, not a high-status profession, and the caste system of the day placed barbers in a lower tier, not the lowest but far from the top. They cut hair. They worked with their hands. Their names were not recorded in the places where names were recorded. Upali had been, by all accounts, a very good barber. He had served the princes of the Sakya clan, the same clan the teacher was born into. He had cut the hair of Siddhartha's cousins. He had known the household from the inside, as servants know households, which is more intimately than anyone admits. When a group of young Sakya princes decided to follow the teacher, they packed their finest things, their jewels and their silk, and they traveled to find him. And on the road, they stopped. And one of them, or perhaps all of them together, the old texts are slightly vague on this, they had the idea that they should not go to a new life carrying the weight of the old one. They took off their jewels, their silk, their rings, and gave everything to Upali. He stood there holding armfuls of the old life, and then he thought about returning to the city, about walking back in, about putting these things in his shop and continuing as before, about the familiar smallness of the life he had always lived. He stood there for a while. Then he hung everything carefully on a tree, left it there for whoever found it, and turned and went the other direction, toward the teacher. He arrived after the Sakya princes. The teacher received him first. This was not an accident. The teacher did this deliberately in front of everyone, making a point that needed to be made without commentary. A barber was received before princes, not as an insult to the princes, as a clarification about what mattered and what did not. Upali would go on to become the monk most trusted with the entire Vinaya, the code of monastic conduct, the detailed rules governing the life of the Sangha, every word of it, every clause. He memorized it all. He became its living repository. The man who had cut hair, who had no family name worth recording, who had hung silk on a tree and walked in the other direction. Nanda, hearing pieces of this story, felt something move in him that he did not have a word for. Not inspiration exactly. Inspiration sounds too much like something that happens quickly. A spark. This was slower, more like the movement of water finding its level, the way water always moves toward the lowest point, not because it is weak, but because it is honest about gravity. He had spent his whole life believing there was a list of who the important teachings were for, and a list of who was allowed to understand things, a list of who qualified. He had always assumed he was not on the list, and here was a barber at the top of the Vinaya. The word he needed, though he did not know it yet, was Sangha and community, the third of the three jewels, which are Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. The one that is easiest to overlook because it does not sound as grand as the other two. But Sangha is where the teaching lives in the world. Not in text, not in any one person's understanding, but in the web of people practicing together, noticing together, failing and trying again together. The barber was Sangha. The merchant who covered the earth with gold was Sangha. Mahapajapati Gotami and the women traveling with her were Sangha. And in the low fields south of the river, counting 20 cows, a man who could not read was beginning very quietly, without fanfare, without anyone to witness it, beginning to be Sangha too. He did not know this yet, but the river knew. It always moves toward its level. Tonight, whoever is beside you in this life, whatever web people holds you, loosely or tightly, knowingly or not, that is your Sangha. You do not have to be a monk to belong to something larger than yourself. You already do. Rest in that tonight. The season after the rains is the most beautiful one. This is true everywhere, but it is especially true along a river when the banks are fresh and the air has that particular quality of things that have been washed and are now drying in the sun. The world smells of itself more strongly in those weeks, more green, more earth, more river. Nanda was in the eastern pasture, his usual tree, the 20 cows grazed. He was thinking about Upali and about Anathapindika and about the gap between who those people were and who he was, and whether the gap mattered, and whether the teacher's answer would be the same for him as it was for a merchant who could cover the ground with gold. He was thinking about this when he heard, on the road below the pasture, the sound of a woman crying, not the sharp sound of sudden grief, the particular sound of a grief that has been going on for a long time, a kind where the breath is ragged and the pauses between the sounds are filled with an exhaustion so deep it is almost silence. He stood. He could see her from the pasture, a woman, perhaps 30, perhaps younger and simply made older by what she was carrying. She was walking slowly along the river road, and she was alone. Nanda climbed down from the pasture, he said. "Are you all right?" She stopped. She looked at him. Her eyes were red. She had been walking a long time, he thought. Her feet were dusty. She said, "I am looking for a man called the Buddha. I was told he sometimes passes on this road." Nanda said, "He does, not every day, but sometimes." She said, "I have been walking for 2 days," he said. "Come and sit. The tree has shade." She sat. Her name was Rohini. She had been ill for a long time. She did not say with what. It did not matter to the story, or rather, it was the kind of thing that mattered differently in different tellings. What mattered was the duration of it. The way the illness had separated her, slowly, from the ordinary texture of life, not from the market and the river bathing and the neighbors calling across fences, from the small daily transactions of a life that includes other people. She had been for 3 years, largely alone. She said, "I heard that the teacher heals people." Nanda was quiet for a moment. He had heard this too, and he had heard it said in different ways by different people, some of whom meant it literally, and some of whom meant something more subtle. He said carefully, "I think it depends on what you mean by healing." She looked at him. He said, "I have not spoken with him many times, but what I have heard is that he does not make the illness disappear. He does not guarantee that the body will become different. He heals something else." She said, "What else is there?" And Nanda, who was not a teacher and had never claimed to be one, said the only thing he knew from his own experience, which was not much but was real. He said, "I lost a cow 3 months ago, one I loved, and I expected to be broken, but I found that something in me already knew she would not be there forever, and in that knowing, Even without having named it, there was something that held me, something underneath the grief. Rohini was quiet, then she said, "That sounds like something that is easier to find when you are grieving a cow than when you are grieving yourself." Nanda thought about this, he said. "You might be right." They sat in silence for a while. The cows grazed, and, as sometimes happens in stories and as sometimes more rarely happens in life, the teacher came. Not alone, he was with Ananda and two others. They were walking from the south, which was not the usual direction. They had been to a village further along the river. Nanda stood. He made a gesture of greeting. He said, "There is a woman here who has been walking for 2 days." The teacher looked at Rohini. He said, "What brings you on a long road?" She told him. She told him about the loneliness. She had been trying to prepare on the walk here what she would say. She had rehearsed the way you rehearse important conversations, the efficient version, the relevant facts, the timeline, the question she needed answered. But when she sat across from him and he looked at her and simply asked, the rehearsed version dissolved. She told him about the first year, when she had thought it would be temporary, when she had made plans for when she was better, had kept those plans alive like small fires she was tending, fully expecting that they would eventually become real. She told him about the second year, and the plans had quietly become impossible, and she had had to let them go one by one, and no one had told her it was okay to do that. So she had done it in private, in the dark, each letting go a small private failure. She told him about the third year, about waking up and finding that the life she had was the life she had, and that the anger about it had gone, but that where the anger used to be there was now something else, a kind of hollow. She said, "I don't know how to live in the hollow." And he said, "That is exactly the right place to start." She did not make it short. She told him about the 3 years, about the illness, about the loneliness that had accumulated like silt, about the way she had watched her own life narrow until she could barely see the edges of it from where she was sitting. He listened, not performing listening, the real thing. When she was finished, he said, "Have you ever been able to give something to someone who needed it?" She said, "I don't have much to give." He said, "That is not what I asked." She thought. She said, "When I was still well, I used to bring food to an old man who lived alone at the edge of our village. He was not able to cook for himself anymore. I did this for 2 years," the teacher said. "And how did that feel?" She said. "It felt good, like the right use of a morning." He said, "Do you remember the feeling? Not just the fact of it, but the feeling, the quality of opening that happens when you give something to someone who needs it?" She said, slowly, "Yes," he said. "That feeling is yours. It lives in you. Not in the old man, not in the food, not in the walking to his door. In you," he said. "The illness has taken many things from you, but it has not taken that. You carry it, and you can give from it even when you have almost nothing else," he said. "Dana does not require abundance. It requires only a hand that knows how to open." Rohini was very still. Then she said, "But I am here because I am suffering." He said, "I know." He said, "There is a word, karuna. It means compassion, but not the kind of compassion that watches suffering from a safe distance and feels sad about it. The kind that steps into the room where the suffering is happening and stays there. The kind that does not flinch." He said, "You have given me a great gift by coming here and telling me your story, and because you have shown me a woman who is practicing karuna on herself. You walked 2 days alone through your own suffering to find something that might help. That is courage. That is karuna pointed inward." He said, "Continue that." He said, "Give what you can from where you are to whoever is near, however small, and notice. Not believe, just notice whether something shifts." Nanda listened to all of this, and later, when Rohini had rested and continued on her way, not healed, not transformed by thunder, but quieter, something in her face a little looser, Nanda thought about karuna, and the word that means the kind of compassion that steps into the room. He thought about stepping into the room. He thought about his whole life, actually. About how much of it he had spent outside rooms, watching, not quite daring, and telling himself he did not qualify. He thought about a barber hanging silk on a tree. about a farmer's daughter kneeling in the mud with a golden bowl, about himself on this ordinary afternoon sitting under his ordinary fig tree, having somehow been present for something that mattered. After Rohini left, Nanda stayed. He sat under the fig tree in the long quiet of the late afternoon and thought about what he had witnessed. He had not done anything. He wanted to be clear about this to himself because there was a temptation. He could feel it at the edges to incorporate what had happened into a story about himself. To think, I was there, I helped, I was part of it. But he had not done anything. He had sat and been present, and the teacher had come, and the teacher had spoken, and Rohini had received something. And yet, Nanda had been changed by it. This was the thing that stayed with him. He had not been the giver or the receiver. He had been simply present, a witness. And the witnessing had changed something in him as surely as if he had been the one who walked 2 days and asked the question. He thought, not perhaps presence is itself a form of practice. He thought about all the times he had been present in his life, all the ordinary witnessings, the sunrise over the pasture, the birth of the calf in January, the neighbor's funeral, the arguments at the well, the small daily business of a village going about itself. He had been present for all of it. He had just not known it counted. The light was changing. A particular golden flattening of late afternoon that always made him think of doors closing, of the day gathering itself before it went. He loved this light and could not have said why, had never had anyone to say why to. He thought about karuna. He thought about what it meant to step into the room where the suffering was. He had been stepping into rooms all his life, into the room of the sick cow, into the room of the flooded field, into the room of his own long solitude. He had stepped in because there was no one else to step in, and the rooms needed someone. He had never thought of this as compassion. He had thought of it as just what you did when you were the one who was there. But perhaps that was the same thing. Perhaps karuna was not a grand gesture reserved for the spiritually advanced. Perhaps it was simply being the one who steps in when the room needs someone. He looked at his hands, rough from the work, brown from the sun, calloused in the places where the rope always falls. Hands that had stepped into rooms. That was something. The chapter-level open loop that had been running since Mala died. The question Nanda carried about whether his not grief was a failure or a wisdom resolved itself quietly in this chapter, without announcement, because what he understood sitting there was this. Anicca had not made him love Mala less. It had made him hold her more honestly, and that more honest holding, that was what had made room for the grief to move through him. Instead of pooling, love without clinging, a hand that knows how to open. He looked at his 20 remaining cows. He said Mala's name once quietly. Then he said the names of the 20 who were there. And at some point, somewhere in the middle of this accounting of who was here and who was gone, Nanda realized he was not happy exactly, but something close to it, or something more precise than happiness, which is at rest. Tonight, if something in you has been carrying loss, a loss of a year ago or a decade or last week, let karuna move toward it. Not dramatically, not with effort. Just the way you would step into a room where someone you love is sitting alone. You don't have to say anything. Just be in the room with it. That is enough. If this brought something up for you, share it below. Whatever it is, there is room here for whatever needs to be set down for a moment. Not all stories in this telling are gentle ones. Some of them carry the weight of what it means to be human in a community, which is to say, sometimes the shadow falls, even inside the most luminous places. You have been walking with the Sangha through its seasons of beauty, through Sujata's golden bowl, through Kandana's awakening, through Rohini's long road and Upali's silk left on a tree. But something was moving underneath all of that, the way a current moves under the surface of a river that looks still. His name was Devadatta. He was the teacher's cousin. He had grown up in the same palace, not quite the same privileges, but close enough to make the difference feel sharp. He was intelligent, he was skilled, he had ordained as a monk, and he had, by most accounts, developed genuine attainments in meditation, and this, strangely, became the problem. Because Devadatta was the kind of person for whom genuine achievement creates, rather than dissolves, a need for recognition, a need for it in this particular place, from this particular person on. He wanted the teacher to name him as successor. The teacher declined, and what followed? The months of Devadatta trying to create a rival faction, of attempting to impose stricter rules on the Sangha, of episodes that the old texts describe with a kind of measured sorrow, is a story about what happens when a real practice is hollowed out by a need the practice was supposed to address. Devadatta was not a villain in the way stories usually mean. He was something more recognizable than that. He was a person of genuine gifts who could not survive the gap between who he was and who he believed he should be. This is worth sitting with, because Devadatta is easy to read as a villain, and the villain reading is both accurate and insufficient. He had real gifts, real attainments, and real hours of practice in the stillness where the mind learns to see itself. And the tragedy, if tragedy is the right word, is that the practice in his case had not yet reached the root of the thing it needed to reach. He had cultivated what was visible, what was measurable, what could be demonstrated and recognized. He had become very good at the parts of the practice that other people could see, and he had left untouched the part that only he could see, the part that asked, "What am I doing this for?" Not the official answer, the real answer, and the one that operates in the small hours and shapes the decisions that never get explained. He did not look at that part, and so the practice, instead of dissolving the need for recognition, had become a vehicle for pursuing it. Not the tools of liberation had been redirected, not in any obvious way, not in any way Devadatta was consciously aware of, toward the very trap they were supposed to help dismantle. The ancient texts call this a kind of corruption, but the teaching does not leave Devadatta there. The teaching says, even this is karma, even this plants a seed, and the seed, whatever its nature, can eventually, over time, perhaps many lifetimes, become something else. Nothing is permanent, not even the trap. He was a person of genuine gifts who could not survive the gap between who he was and who he believed he should be. And that gap, that particular human wound, made him dangerous. Nanda heard about this the way he heard about most things, in fragments with gaps. He heard that there was trouble in the Sangha, that some monks had left, that there had been a conflict involving the teacher's own family. He heard this and felt for the first time a thing he had not expected to feel about the teaching. He felt afraid, not afraid of the teaching, afraid of the fragility of it, the fact that even the most careful, most beautiful thing built by human hands and human hearts could be cracked by a single person's unaddressed hunger. He thought, if even the Sangha is not safe from this, what chance does anything have? He walked with this question for several days, and then one evening, it was a festival evening, the village lamps were lit, the air smelled of incense and cooked rice. He passed by the usual resting spot on the road and found Ananda there. He sat down without being invited. Ananda looked up from his reading. Nanda said, "I heard about what is happening with the Sangha." Ananda said, "Yes." Nanda said, Does it break your faith?" Ananda was quiet for a moment. This was not the quietness of someone searching for a diplomatic answer. It was the quietness of someone being honest with themselves first. Then he said, "There was a moment when I thought it might, when I saw people I respected leave, and I wondered, if the teaching were true, would this be possible? If the Sangha were what I believed it to be, could it be fractured like this?" He said, "And then I thought about karma." Nanda said, "What does that mean?" Ananda said, "Karma means you know how seeds work. You plant a seed and the seed grows into the plant. That is the nature of the seed. An apple seed grows an apple tree. A bitter seed grows a bitter plant," he said. "Karma is the same. Every action we take, every word, every intention, every subtle movement of the mind toward one direction or another, that is a seed. And the seed becomes what its nature was." He said, "What Devadatta has planted will become what it is." What? the Sangha has planted will become what it is. They are different seeds. They will grow differently, he said. The teaching was never promised to be safe from human failure. The teaching is precisely about human failure, about why it happens and how to meet it, and what can grow from having met it, honestly. Nanda sat with this. He said, so the crack in the Sangha is not evidence against the teaching? Nanda said, it is the teaching, becoming visible. This is where a different kind of quiet fell. Nanda had been, without fully knowing it, looking for a practice that would be perfect, that would be safe, that would be, in some sense, removed from the ordinary damage of the human world. And Ananda was telling him that this was not available, that the Dharma did not protect people from being human. It offered them a way to be human more honestly, more clearly, with more willingness to see. That was different. That was in some ways harder. But it was also, Nanda thought, sitting in the lamplit village air, more true, more useful, more aligned with the actual world, which had never once, in his entire life, stopped being complicated. Here is what the river knew that no one else did. Karma is not punishment. This is what most people misunderstand about it. They hear it as a cosmic ledger. Do bad things and bad things come back to you. Do good things and good things follow. But the teaching is subtler than that. Karma is about the quality of intention behind the action. The seed is not the deed itself. The seed is the movement of mind that preceded the deed, the craving or the generosity, the contraction or the opening that happened in the instant before the action took form. This means every moment is a planting. Right now, in the way you are holding whatever you are holding, the tension in the shoulders, the quality of attention, the slight turning toward or away from what is present. Right now, you are planting something, not forever, not irreversibly, but something. The teaching says, notice. Not in order to judge yourself, in order to see what you are growing. In a monastery not far from where this story takes place, there is a garden. Or rather, in the research that forms part of this story, there is a study. A careful one, conducted by neuroscientists who have spent decades measuring what happens inside the brain of someone who practices karuna meditation, who practices the kind of compassion that steps into the room. What they found, over years and many thousands of participants, is this. The regular practice of compassion, not as a feeling performed but as a trained orientation of attention, measurably, physically changes the structure of the brain. The areas associated with empathy and the areas associated with resilience are both, with practice, enlarged, not metaphorically, literally. The tissue grows, which means the ancient teaching that compassion is a practice, that it is something you build the way you build a muscle, not just something you feel. That teaching has a physical substrate, a visible signature in the matter of the brain itself. Karma, the seed and what the seed becomes. The monk, who was also a gardener, would have found this unsurprising. He would have said, of course. What did you think was happening? Before Nanda walked home, he sat for a moment on the step of his neighbor's house where the lamp was lit and the air was warm with cooking. He was thinking about karma, not in the abstract, in the specific. He was thinking about what he himself had planted. He thought about the years before the teacher came into his awareness, about the ordinary moral texture of those years, the small cheats he had not committed, but had thought about, the times he had been short with someone because he was tired and they were in his way, the times he had not helped when helping was possible and would have cost him something. He was not a bad man. He had never thought of himself as a bad man, but he had never thought of himself as a man who was actively planting either. He had thought of himself as a man who was surviving, and surviving, he now understood, is still planting. The seed is in the manner of the surviving, in the quality of attention, in the small daily choices about what to move toward and what to turn away from. He thought about Devadatta. He thought, that man did not wake up one morning and decide to be the kind of person who fractures a sangha. He had been planting seeds for a long time. Seeds of needing to be first, of needing to be acknowledged, of tying his worth to the recognition of one specific person. And those seeds grew, he thought, What am I planting? He sat with the question seriously, not as a spiritual exercise, as the same practical reckoning he did every evening when he assessed the field, what had been done, what still needed doing, what the ground had received today, and what it might grow. He thought about the conversation with the teacher on the road. He had asked, "Can someone like me learn?" He thought about what the asking itself had planted. He thought about the fact that he had, in the months since, been different with his cows. Not dramatically, not with any intention, but different. A little slower to frustration, a little quicker to notice when one of them was struggling before the struggling became obvious. A little more willing to sit beside them in the evening without needing the sitting to accomplish something. Was that karma? He thought. Maybe karma is not something you track from the outside. Maybe it is something you feel from the inside, when you become still enough to notice the quality of who you are becoming. He was becoming slightly different. He did not have a word for the direction, but it felt under his hand in the dark, the way the earth feels in the days just before something begins to push through. Nanda walked home through the festival evening. The lamps were reflected in the puddles left by the afternoon rain. He thought about Devadatta, who had planted what he had planted. He thought about Upali and Anathapindika and Rohini, who had planted what they had planted. He thought about himself walking home in the lamplight with 20 cows and a piece of yellow cloth and a handful of questions that were slowly becoming something else. He thought, I am also planting. This thought made him careful. Not afraid, careful, the way you are careful with a seed you want to see grow well. Darkness falls and the story turns. You've walked a long way now with Nanda, and with the Sangha, and with the river that runs through all of it. You've seen gentleness and loss and the beginning of understanding. But some of the most important teachings in this tradition did not come from peaceful gardens. They came from places most people walked past as quickly as they could. There was, in the land of Magadha, a practice of leaving bodies for cremation in designated grounds at the edge of towns and villages. These grounds, what the texts call charnel grounds, not place of the dead, were not pleasant places. They were necessary places. Places where the reality of what bodies do was made visible, where nothing about mortality was hidden or softened. People avoided them, except sometimes wandering ascetics, who would sit in charnel grounds deliberately, meditating amid the evidence of impermanence, using what was there to sharpen their understanding, and sometimes the children who had nowhere else to go. His name was Sopaka. Before we go further, let me say something about names. In the world where this story takes place, names carried weight, not always in the ways power assigns weight, not always the names of the high-born, names carved in stone. The names that appear at the front of records. Sometimes the names that carry the most weight are the ones that survive because of a single story and a single moment when something was witnessed that was worth remembering. Soka's name survived because of a morning, because a man stopped on a road and said, "What is your name?" And a child who had been practicing invisibility for long enough that it had become a second skin, that child looked up. That is how names are saved. Not by monuments, by the quality of attention one person brings to another on an ordinary morning. He was, the teachers say, perhaps 7 years old, perhaps 8. He had been left in the charnel ground by a stepmother who did not want him. The text is sparse on the details. It does not dramatize the abandonment. It simply states it the way a document records a fact. Sopaka lived at the edge of the charnel ground. He had learned by necessity to be invisible, not to be quiet, to move through the edges of the world in ways that did not attract attention. On the morning this story finds him, he was sitting in the shadow of a wall, watching the road. There is a detail in this story easy to miss. A group of monks came along the road, and with them, at his usual place slightly apart from the others, the teacher. Sopaka did not look up. He had learned that looking up at strangers was rarely useful. But the teacher stopped, and he stopped and turned and looked directly at the boy in the shadow. Sopaka still did not look up. The teacher said, in the direction of the shadow, without drama, without performance, "What is your name?" This was the strange thing. He said it the way you say it to a child who is expected to have a name, not the way adults usually spoke to a child who had been left in a charnel ground. Sopaka looked up. He said, "Sopaka." The teacher said, "Hello, Sopaka. Not will you sit with us for a while? Not where are your parents? Not why are you here?" Not the questions that would require the boy to explain his situation, to account for himself, to justify his existence in this place. Just, will you sit with us? Sopaka sat with them. And in the hour that followed, the monks meditating, the teacher speaking occasionally to Sopaka in the quiet voice he used for conversations that were not meant to be overheard by everyone. Something was passed from one person to a very small, very watchful person who had been surviving on the edges for a long time. What was passed was not a doctrine. It was not an explanation. It was attention, sustained, unflickering attention, the kind that says, "You are not invisible to me." The kind that says, "Your being here is not a mistake that needs to be corrected." Ahimsa. The word means non-harming, not causing injury to any living being. But it goes further than the absence of violence. Ahimsa, as the teacher practiced it, included the refusal to harm even through inattention, even through the ordinary human habit of sorting living beings into those who matter and those who do not. He stopped for the child in the shadow. This is not a story about cruelty or about justice or about punishment. This is not a story about magical transformation. This is not a story about a child who suffered and then was rescued. This is a story about what attention does, about the fact that being seen, truly simply seen by another person, is one of the most profound things that can happen to a human being, at any age, in any condition. Nanda was not there for this. He heard about it later, indirectly. Someone who had been on the road that morning mentioned it to someone in the village, who mentioned it to someone else. The story reached Nanda in the usual way, in pieces with gaps. But the piece that stayed with him was small and specific. He stopped and looked at the boy. He said, "What is your name?" Nanda thought about all the times no one had said his name as if it mattered. All the times he had been a figure in a field, a man with cows, a presence that was useful or not useful, not seen or not seen, based entirely on whether he was in someone's way. He thought about the teacher stopping on the road. He felt something shift in him. Not a dramatic shift, the kind of shift that happens inside a hinge, invisible from outside, but the door no longer hangs the same way. And then something else arrived, not in the story he heard, but in his own body, walking home, because there was a figure on the edge of the road ahead of him. Not a child, a man, sitting in the last of the evening light, his back against a tree, watching the road with eyes that did not seem afraid exactly, but held something. Nanda did not know who he was. He only knew that something made him slow. He slowed and he felt on the back of his neck the quality of the air around this man. He had felt this once before, on the road, the morning he had spoken to the teacher for the first time. A different quality. The teacher's air had been open, like a field after rain. This man's air was different. It was the air of someone who has closed their hand around something and is now learning, slowly, painfully, hour by hour, to open it again. Not violence, not threat, practice, the hard kind. The kind that doesn't look like practice because it doesn't look like anything except a man sitting against a tree in the evening light. But Nanda had spent enough time around people and animals who were working through something to recognize the quality, and something in his own body, his own blood and breath, and the particular pattern of his years responded to it, not with fear, with recognition. He thought, I also am working through something. He thought, everyone I have met on this road is working through something, and none of them are doing it alone. Even when they look alone, he kept going. He passed the man. The man did not look up, but Nanda felt walking past the same thing he had felt watching the monks walk around his cows all those months ago. The sense that something was present that was larger than its container. Later in the village, someone told him who the man was. He had been, until not long ago, a person who had done great harm, who had, under the grip of a belief taken to its extreme, become something that still frightened people who remembered. The teacher had walked toward him. The teacher had stopped. And whatever had happened in that encounter, the texts describe it, but the description cannot quite carry what the description is pointing at. Whatever had happened had changed the direction of things. The man against the tree was practicing, sitting in the evening, letting the fear of passers-by wash over him, not defending against it, letting the consequence of what he had been move through the world around him without pretending it wasn't there. This was, Nanda thought, a different kind of courage than the kind he had been thinking about. This was the courage of staying. He walked home. His cows followed the way they always followed, not because they were compelled, not because they had no choice, but because 20 years of walking together had made the following simply what they did. The relationship was embedded in the body, in the habit, in the accumulated trust of 10,000 mornings. He thought about Sopaka. He thought about what it meant to be a child who had learned to be invisible, who had survived by reducing the surface area of himself that the world could find, who had curled inward not from weakness but from the deep animal intelligence of a creature that understands which environments are safe and which are not. He had done this himself in smaller ways. Not in charnel grounds, his own field, in his own village, in the ordinary social landscape of a man who has learned that the safest position is the one that asks nothing and expects nothing, and therefore cannot be disappointed. He had made himself small, not once, not in a crisis. Over years, the slow project of reducing expectation, reducing reach, reducing the surface area that could be hurt. And then someone on a path had said, "How many cows do you have?" "None," and had waited for the real answer. And something in him that had been curled inward, something he had not known was curled, had very slightly begun to uncurl. He thought about the man against the tree. He thought about what it meant to stay, not to run, not to hide, not to make yourself small enough that the consequences cannot find you, but to stay in the full visibility of what you have been and what you have done. Let the world respond as it responds, and not flinch from the response. That was a different kind of courage than the kind he had been thinking about. He had been thinking about the courage of walking forward towards something. This was the courage of standing still when everything in you wants to leave. He thought, I have been practicing a small version of this. Every morning, counting. Even on the mornings when the count is one fewer, staying present with what is there and what is not there, without looking away. That was a small version. He thought about what the larger version might ask of him. He did not know yet, but the question had arrived, which meant the practice was ahead of him, somewhere on the road. His cows followed. He thought about the child in the shadow who looked up when his name was called. He thought about the man against the tree who had stayed. He thought about what it would mean to be seen and to stay and to let the world be exactly what the world is without flinching away from the hardest parts of it. He did not have a word for this yet, but somewhere in the 3 miles between the road and his field, walking behind 20 cows in the late evening light, he felt that he was not there yet, but pointed in a direction. The way a compass points, not moving, but oriented. And somewhere in that orientation, the small persistent question he had been carrying since the day on the road, the question, can someone like me learn, had become, without his noticing, something slightly different. It had become, I am learning, present tense, no longer a question. By now you've been on the road a long time. You've walked with Nanda through 3 seasons, through rain and grief and the quiet shock of being seen by a teacher on a path, through a barber's silk left on a tree, a merchant's gold laid on the ground, a child who looked up when a stranger said his name. Something is moving in Nanda. He can feel it the way you feel a current in water when you are standing in a river, not visible, not dramatic, but real. something shifting the direction of things beneath the surface, and he still had not asked the question that was underneath all the other questions, that was about to change. This is the moment everything changes. It happened in a season between the rains and the cold, not a season that does not have a strong name in the calendar. One of those transitional weeks when the air is not fully one thing or another. When the mornings are cool enough that you want a fire, the afternoons are warm enough that you forget you wanted one. Ananda came to the village, not passing through. He came specifically to the village, which was unusual. Nanda was in his field. Ananda found him there. He said, "There is someone who has been asking about you." Nanda looked up. Ananda said, "The teacher. He asked if I knew a cowherd in this village who had spoken with him on the road some time ago." Nanda was quiet. He said, "Why?" Ananda said, "I didn't say." He said, "I would like to speak with him again if he is willing." This is the part that still puzzles scholars of the ordinary kind. The kind who wonder why a great teacher would seek out a cowherd. And why not the other way around? Why the mountain would come to the ordinary man. But perhaps the puzzle rests on a misunderstanding of what the mountain is. Nanda walked with Ananda for 2 hours. He had left his cows with his neighbor's eldest son, who was reliable with animals. He had put on his least-torn garment. He had tucked the yellow cloth, still there, still folded against his chest, a little more carefully. He found the teacher sitting near the river, not in a formal setting, not in the monastery, not on a teaching seat, just sitting at the bank of the river where it widened and the current slowed, the afternoon shade of a tree that leaned over the water. He looked up when they arrived. He said, "Sit." They sat. For a while, longer than Nanda expected. No one said anything. The river made its sound, and a bird somewhere in the branches above them landed, and then thought better of it and left. The shadows moved a little on the surface of the water. Then the teacher said, "You have been walking with questions for a long time," Nanda said. "Yes," he said. "Which one is heaviest?" Nanda thought. He had thought many questions were the heaviest at different times. Is Anicca true? Can someone like me learn? What does Dana feel like when you have almost nothing to give? And what happens to the people who have done great harm? But the one that was heaviest, when he reached for it now, the one that had been there longer than the others, quieter than the others, sitting at the bottom of all the others the way stones sit at the bottom of a river. He said, "I am a very ordinary person. I have a field that floods. I cannot read. I have been alive for 40 years and I have not done anything that anyone will remember. Is there anything here for someone like that?" Silence, not the silence of someone thinking of a response, not the silence of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear exactly this question and is now receiving it. Then the teacher did something Nanda did not expect. He did not answer. He pointed at the river. He said, "Do you see how the river runs?" Nanda said, "Yes." He said, "Does the river ask permission to run?" Nanda said, "No." He said, "Does it run differently in the section that passes through the city than in the section that passes through the field?" Nanda said, "The current is the same. The banks are different." The teacher was quiet. Then he said, Dhamma runs the way the river runs. It does not go to the palace first. It does not go where the reading is. It goes wherever the ground is open to it." He said, "The question you are asking is, am I open to it?" He said, "You have been opening for a long time." Nanda sat with that. He said, "I don't feel open. I feel full of doubt and questions and things I don't understand." The teacher said, "Yes, that is different from closed." He said, "Closed is when the doubt stops asking, when the questions stop pressing, when the not understanding is something you have made your peace with because looking has become too difficult." He said, "You have not done that. You are here." Nanda said, "I almost didn't come." The teacher smiled. He said, "Almost is the whole story." They sat for a while longer. The river light changed. Not. It does that in the afternoon. It shifts from the direct light of midday to something more lateral, more golden, something that makes the surface of the water look like it is lit from beneath rather than from above. Nanda said, "Can I ask something else?" The teacher said, "Yes." He said, "I have been watching people come to you for a long time, the merchants and the mothers and the monks and the scholars, and I have watched what happens when they leave. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they are different. The way the air is different after rain. Not exactly, but something has shifted." He said, "What shifts?" The teacher looked at the water. He said, "The thing that shifts is what they believe about who is in the room with them." Nanda did not understand. He said, "What do you mean?" The teacher said, "Most people live as if they are in a room alone, as if the suffering is happening in a room with only them in it. No one else has felt this particular ache, this particular longing, this particular loss. They are alone in the room with it," he said. "What shifts is the understanding that the room is full." He said, "Every person who has ever lived has stood in the room with loss, with the not quite right feeling, with the question that doesn't have a clean answer. The room is crowded with people who have been exactly where you are." He said, "When you feel that not as a belief but as a felt thing, a thing the body knows, the ache does not disappear, but it is no longer yours alone." He said, "That changes the weight of it." Nanda sat with this. He thought about Rohini walking 2 days alone. He thought about Upali on the road with his arms full of silk. He thought about Sopaka in the shadow, who had been alone for a very long time, and had looked up when someone said his name. He thought, the room is full. He had never thought the room was full before. They sat together for a while longer, and the chapter-level loop that had been carried since Ananda's words about Saddha, faith, not blind faith, but the kind of trust that comes from looking, resolved itself here, not in a dramatic declaration, but in the quality of the sitting, in the fact that Nanda had come, had walked 2 hours toward a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered, and had received something he didn't have a word for yet, Nanda. The Pali word means faith, but again, the translation flattens it. Saddha is not belief without evidence. It is not the agreement to accept a doctrine you have not tested. Saddha is the willingness to take the next step before you can see what's on the other side of it. It is the trust that accumulates from watching, from a conversation on a road, from a barber who left silk on a tree, and from a merchant who covered the ground with gold, from a child who looked up when someone said his name, from a woman who walked 2 days alone and came back quieter. Nadha is what happens when you have watched the river run long enough to trust that it knows where it's going. And there is something important in the river metaphor. River does not know where it's going in the way a traveler knows, by having been told, by having consulted a map, by having received directions from someone who has made the journey before. The river knows the way water knows, not through the body, through the following of what is already moving, through the simple fact of being itself in the presence of gravity and landscape, and letting the being itself do the navigating. Saddha is like this. You do not come to Saddha by being convinced, by having the argument laid out and finding it satisfactory, by checking the evidence and concluding that the path is worth taking. You come to Saddha by having walked a little way down the path and found that the walking did not kill you, by having put weight on the step and found it held, by having been present again and again with what the practice actually offers, and finding that what it offers is more real than what you gave up by showing up for it. Nanda had been walking for 3 years. The path had not killed him. The step had held. Not something in him, not the part that argued, not the part that assessed, but the deeper part, the part that the body is in charge of, had concluded, this is the direction. That was Saddha, not certainty, not the absence of doubt, not the end of the questions. Just this direction. Keep walking. Saddha is what happens when you have watched the river run long enough to trust that it knows where it's going. On the loop from chapter 9. Nanda's fear on the road, past the man against the tree, resolved itself in a different way, also without announcement. He asked the teacher about it. He said, "There was a man I passed on the road, as someone who had done great harm, and I was afraid," he said. "And then later I thought about what the fear meant. about whether the fear was about him or about something in me, about the possibility that I am also capable of harm, that I have also, in small ways and large ways, caused suffering I have not always named clearly. The teacher looked at him for a long time. He said, "That thought, the one you just described, is the beginning of the end of harm." None, he said, not the person who has never done harm, the person who has seen their capacity for it clearly and decided with full knowledge to go the other direction. He said, "Ahimsa is not innocence. It is a choice made from knowledge." Nanda nodded. He did not say anything else. He walked home in the early evening. The road was the same road it had always been. The same stones, the same bend where the fig tree leaned, the same smell of cook fires beginning, of the village settling into itself for the night. Everything was the same, and yet he walked it differently. He could not have explained how, exactly, not faster or slower, not more upright, not with any visible change that someone watching from a doorway would have been able to name. But he was aware, walking, of the road in a way he had not been before. Not the road as something to cross in order to arrive somewhere else. The road as the actual surface of his actual life, worth attention, worth the full presence of whatever he was. He had spent most of his life moving through the road to get somewhere. Tonight he was walking on it. He thought about what the teacher had said, about the room full of people, about the fact that the ache of being human was not a private ache, not a sealed room with only him in it, but a room crowded with everyone who had ever lived and felt this and moved through it. He had always lived as if the room were empty. This was not self-pity. It was simply the fact of his life. A life without the particular comfort of being understood, of being seen in the fullness of what he was carrying. He had carried what he carried alone, not because he wanted to, but because there was no one offering to help carry it, and he had not known he was allowed to ask. He thought about Sangha now differently, not as a group of people who had achieved something he had not yet achieved. As a group of people who had understood or were understanding imperfectly on the way that the room was full and who had decided to be in the full room together. He thought, "I would like to be in that room," he thought. "Perhaps I already am." He passed his neighbor's house. The neighbor was sitting outside with his youngest child, a boy of about 6, who was trying to catch a firefly in his cupped hands. The firefly kept escaping. The boy kept trying. The neighbor watched with the particular patience of someone who understands that the trying is the point. Nanda raised a hand. The neighbor raised a hand. The boy did not look up. The firefly escaped again. He walked on home. His cows were fine. His neighbor's son had counted them. 20. He counted them himself, name by name, in the dark, and went to sleep. He slept well that night. Perhaps the best sleep of his life, which was saying something, because Nanda had always been a man who slept simply and deeply, a sleep of bodies that have worked hard and have nothing left in them to fight with. But that night there was something different in the dark, something that had been holding itself slightly apart, the way a person holds themselves when they are not sure they are welcome, had, without announcement, settled in. Not enlightenment, not transformation, just belonging. And if you are still awake, let that word rest somewhere in you before you sleep. Belonging, not the kind that requires you to earn it, not the kind contingent on being a certain size, a certain status, a certain level of understanding, the kind the river has, which flows not because it has permission, but because flowing is its nature. You have a nature too. Rest in it tonight. 3 rainy seasons. That is how long Nanda had carried the yellow cloth. He had not forgotten it. You cannot forget something you carry against your skin, against your chest, every day through every season. It becomes part of the texture of your days, a familiar weight, a slightly rougher surface in the fold of the garment, a reminder that is not a reminder of anything specific yet, just a reminder that something is waiting to be understood. And somewhere in the weeks after his conversation at the river, the moment came, not dramatically. Let me tell you about Nagasena first. Nagasena was a monk who lived in a different time and place than this story. In the land of the Northwest, in a period when a Greek king named Melinda ruled a kingdom that had absorbed the languages of two worlds. The king was intelligent and combative, and had the habits of mind of a person trained in argument. He enjoyed the kind of thinking that tests everything, that does not rest until it has pushed something to see what falls. He had been trying to defeat every monk he met in debate. He had not been losing. Then he met Nagasena. The king said to Nagasena, "What is your name?" Nagasena said, "I am called Nagasena, but a name is a convention. It does not point to any real and permanent self." The king said, "If there is no self, who is it that meditates, who observes the precepts, who attains nibbana?" Nagasena said, "Let me ask you something. You came here in a chariot." The king said, "Yes." Nagasena said, "Is the chariot the axle?" The king said, "No." "Is the chariot the wheels?" "No." "Is it the frame, the pole, the harness, the driver?" "No, no, no, no." Nagasena said, "So where is the chariot?" The king was silent. Nagasena said, "Chariot is a name, a useful name for a useful combination of parts working together. But there is no chariot essence underneath the parts, no permanent chariot self that persists when the wheels are replaced and the frame is repaired and the driver changes." He said, "A person is like this, a useful name for a process that is always in motion, always changing. A person who carried grief last season is not the same combination of moments as the person who carries something else now." The king was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Nagasena, you have answered well. Pay attention to this. And this is not an abstract debate. This is the center of something. Because the thing Nanda had been carrying for 3 rainy seasons, the question underneath the question underneath the question was exactly this. It was, who am I? Is there someone here worth saving? Is there a Nanda who is permanent enough to be worth the effort?" And the teaching of the chariot says, "You are not your name. You are not your poverty. You are not the 40 years of ordinary days. You are not the man with 20 cows, or the man who cannot read, or the man whom no one would remember. You are a process, a river, always moving, never the same water twice, which means the next moment is not bound by the last one. Next moment is open. Now, the yellow cloth. It happened in the 3rd week after the cold had settled in. Nanda was walking on the road he always walked on the way to the high pasture, and he passed a monk, an older monk, one he had not seen before, resting under a tree at the side of the road. The monk was thin in the way of very old men who have eaten simply all their lives. Not the thinness of illness, but the thinness of the long project of simplification. The stripping away, over decades, of everything that is not essential. His robes were the same yellow as the cloth Nanda carried. They stopped and looked at each other. The monk said, "You're the cowherd." Nanda said, "Yes." The monk said, "The teacher mentioned you." Something in Nanda's chest moved. He said, "What did he say?" The monk said, "He said there is a cowherd in the village to the south who has been walking toward the Dhamma for 3 years without knowing he has been walking toward the Dhamma." Nanda said, "That sounds like something he would say." The monk was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name is Punna. I have been teaching in the East, in the land of Sunaparanta, where the people they are not easy. They have a reputation for directness that some people call harshness." He smiled slightly, as if he did not find this a problem. He said, "When I told the teacher where I wanted to go, he said, 'The people of Sunaparanta will insult you.' 'What will you do?' I said. 'I will be grateful that they do not throw things,' he said. 'And what if they throw things?' I said. 'I will be grateful that they do not throw weapons,' he said. 'And what if they wound you?' I said. 'I will be grateful that they do not kill me,' he said. 'And if they kill you?' I said, 'I will be grateful that there are others in this world who end their lives by their own hand in pursuit of the teaching. What they will do to me is not so different.'" Punna paused, he said. "The teacher laughed and told me to go." Nanda held this story in his hands for a while. He said, "I don't think I could do that." Punna said, "Neither did I, until I was doing it. The panna, the wisdom, does not arrive first and then allow you to act. It arrives in the acting, in the doing, in the fact of walking toward the thing that frightens you and noticing that you are walking and the world does not end. Panna, wisdom, not information. not the accumulation of things known. The particular quality of seeing that comes from having walked through the dark and paid attention on the way. The monk adjusted his robe, and as he did, Nanda saw the edge of the fabric, frayed at one corner, the old kind of fraying that comes from much washing, much wearing, much use. The fraying, he reached into his garment. He pulled out the yellow cloth. He held it out. The monk looked at it. He said quietly, "Where did you find that?" Nanda said, "3 rainy seasons ago, by the river, in the morning. I never knew who left it." The monk took the small piece of cloth and turned it over in his hands. Something in his face became very still. The older monk's face, as he held the cloth, had the quality of a face that is remembering something and allowing the remembering to be present on its surface, without hiding it. He said he was young when he came, younger than you might think, had been driving cattle since he was a boy, not in this region, further east, near the hills. He came to the Sangha because he did not know exactly why. He told me once that he had been watching the monks pass on the road for 2 seasons, and one morning he had simply followed. He said he was frightened at first. The way people who have spent their whole life being told they are the wrong kind of person are frightened when they are offered something different, as if the offering must be a mistake, as if at any moment the real rules will reassert themselves and he will be sent back. He said, the teacher received him, not specially, not with ceremony. The way a river receives a stone, it simply admits it, finds the shape around it and continues. He said, he was a very good monk. He understood things from the inside, from the body, from the years in the field, that some of the scholars understood only in the mind. He could explain Anicca without any words, just by the way he held a thing and then set it down. Nanda held the empty place where the cloth had been. He said, what was his name? The old monk said a name, a simple name, not one anyone had carved into stone. Nanda did not ask more. The name was enough. He said, a student of mine, a young man who came to the Sangha from the eastern villages, who was also a cowherd before he ordained. He lost a piece of his robe in the monsoon 3 seasons ago. Along the river south of here, he said. He asked me for a long time whether he should go back and look for it. I told him, let it go. What is lost in the river is the river's, he said. I did not think it would come back like this. And then something loosened in Nanda that he had not fully known was tight. The cloth had belonged to a cowherd. Someone who had walked the same paths he walked, driven animals the same way, counted names in the early morning. Someone who had been, like him, a person no history would record. And that person had found the Dharma, had walked toward it, had taken the step. Not a prince, not a merchant, not a scholar, a cowherd. Nanda held the empty place in his garment where the cloth had been. He looked at the monk. He looked at his own hands. And for 3 years he had carried the cloth without knowing why. And he had carried it through the rains and through the dry seasons and through the conversation on the path and the loss of Mala and the night by the fire and the walk to the edge of the monastery. He had carried it against his chest, against his heartbeat, a piece of someone else's practice pressed against his own ordinary life. And now it was gone. Back to where it came from, back to the monk who had lost it, or to the monk's teacher who would hear the story, or simply back to the vast shared territory of things that have circulated long enough to lose clear ownership. He had thought he would feel the absence. He felt, instead, something more like completion, not the completion of a task. Nothing had been accomplished exactly in the way of tasks. The cloth had traveled downstream for 3 seasons and then traveled back upstream in the hands of the man who had picked it up without knowing why. That was the whole of the accomplishment. And yet, he thought about the chariot that Nagasena had described to King Milinda. The wheel, the axle, the frame, the driver. None of them the chariot, all of them together the chariot. He thought about himself. Nanda the cowherd, Nanda with 20 cows and a leaking fence and a piece of yellow cloth he had carried for 3 rainy seasons. None of those things the full truth of him. All of them together, a process, a river, always moving, never the same twice, but recognizably, continuingly itself, he thought. I am not the same combination of moments I was 3 years ago. This was neither good nor bad, it was simply true. The cloth was gone, he was here. The river was still running. He looked at the monk. He said, what was his name? The old monk said a name. A simple name, not one anyone had carved into stone. Nanda did not ask more. The name was enough. He said, did he find what he was looking for? Punna said, with the smile of someone who has spent a long time in the company of an answer to exactly this question. Yes, I believe he did. The master open loop resolved itself here, on a road with an old monk, over a piece of yellow cloth that had traveled 3 seasons to get back to where it pointed. Not a dramatic resolution, not a lightning bolt. A river finding its level, a wheel coming full. Tonight, you have been carrying something for a long time too. Maybe you know what it is, maybe you don't yet. Maybe it is the kind of thing that needs 3 seasons or 10, or a conversation on a road with someone who turns out to hold the other end of the thread you've been following. Panna, the wisdom that arrives in the walking. You are already walking, the cold deepened. The land where this story takes place, the cold is not the kind that buries everything under snow. It is a subtler cold, a clarifying cold, the kind that makes the air sharp and the stars very clear and the smoke from evening fires rise straight up into the dark without bending. Nanda built a fire at the edge of the field. He did this most cold evenings. It kept the insects away, kept the larger animals at a distance, kept the darkness from feeling quite so large. He had built this fire so many times in so many seasons that the building of it was something his hands did without his attention. The arrangement of wood, the kindling, the careful breath to encourage the first flame. The cows settled. This is what cattle do on cold nights. They settle into each other, the warmth of one contributing to the warmth of the whole, until the herd becomes something that looks, from a certain distance, like a single creature with many breathing parts. Nanda sat beside his fire and looked at the sky. He had been thinking since the morning's conversation with Punna about a story he had heard months ago from a monk who had traveled far to the east. The monk had spoken about a teacher who was very old and had been asked near the end of his life about an image, a cracked bowl. No, the teacher, his name was Ajahn Chah, and he had lived and taught and held the Dharma in his particular way in the land east of the great mountains. He had picked up a bowl and looked at it. He said, "This bowl is already broken." The monks around him looked at the bowl. It was not broken. It was whole, perfect, a good bowl, he said. In my mind, this bowl is already broken. It has already been knocked from the shelf and shattered on the floor. I have already held it in fragments. I have already let it go, he said. And so every day I drink from it, I drink knowing it is already broken. Every time it catches the light and the glaze looks like river water, I see it clearly as it is, which is a thing that will not last, a thing in the process of becoming broken, he said, and because I know this, I can love the bowl completely. He set it down. He said, that is how I live. Nanda had heard this story and carried it the way he carried the yellow cloth, without knowing exactly what to do with it, but unable to put it down. He understood it now, sitting by his fire. He understood it with his body rather than his mind, which is the only way you can understand something like this. Because this is not a teaching about detachment. This is not a story about caring less. This is not a teaching that says, do not love your bowl, do not love your cows, do not love the people who stand beside you on the road. This is a story about loving them with your eyes open. The bowl is already broken. The cow will not be there forever. The morning will end, and the day will end, and the season will end. And the person standing next to you is like you in the process of passing through. And this clear-eyed seeing is not sadness. It is the thing that makes the bowl worth drinking from. It is the thing that makes the morning count. It is the thing that makes the naming of the names Mala, Sona, Kali, the one's here, the one gone, not a sad exercise but a form of grace. The word was nibbana, And before anything else is said about it, let me tell you what it is not. It is not the extinction of the self, not the disappearance of Nanda into a kind of spiritual vapor, the dissolution of everything he was into undifferentiated nothing. This is a misunderstanding that has traveled far, and it is a misunderstanding because the original word is being heard in the wrong register. Nibbana literally means the going out of a flame. In the ancient world, a flame was understood not as a thing destroyed when it went out, but as a process that had stopped. The heat, the light, the movement, not annihilated, but no longer agitated, no longer consuming, no longer driven. The fire that has gone out is not nothing. It is the absence of burning. And the absence of burning, if you have been burning for a long time, if the burning has been something you did not choose and could not stop, if the burning has been the constant low-grade friction of wanting things to be different from what they are, the absence of burning is not nothing. It is rest. It is the particular quality of rest that only arrives when something that has been consuming you has finally been set down. Nanda sat by his fire and thought about what he was still burning. Not dramatically, not in crisis. Noticed. The way you notice the heat of a lamp only when you move closer to it, that there was still some friction running, some small persistent wanting, some residue of the old question, does someone like me qualify? That had not fully cooled. But it was less, it was measurably less than it had been, and that tonight was enough to notice. The word was Nibbana, not the dramatic version, not the fire going out, the total extinction, the end of everything. The simpler version, the one that is available on an ordinary evening, sitting by a fire, looking at 20 cows who have settled into each other for warmth. Nibbana is the cooling, releasing of the heat that comes from craving, from resistance, from the constant friction of wanting things to be different from what they are. It is not nothingness. It is the peace that exists when the friction stops, not forever, perhaps not even for very long, but in the moments when it is there, even briefly, even in the gap between one breath and the next. It is the most real thing that has ever happened to you. Nanda sat by his fire. He was not enlightened. He would not have known what to do with enlightenment if it had arrived. He was a cowherd in a field on a cold night, watching 20 animals breathe together in the dark. But something in him was cooler than it had been, something that had been running hot. The friction of the question, does someone like me qualify, had slowed, not stopped, slowed, and in the slowing there was something, space, room. The particular quality of air that exists in a room where someone has just set down something heavy. Somewhere tonight, there is a person lying in the dark before sleep. Maybe you know this person well. Maybe you are this person. They have done the day's work. They have been what they were required to be. The parent, the worker, the friend, the one who held things together. They have eaten. They have come home. And now in the dark, before sleep claims them, something is loosening, something that has been held a little too tightly. Maybe it is a version of themselves they have been trying to maintain, a way of being that required constant effort, constant friction, a constant quiet labor of making sure the bowl did not appear broken. Let the bowl be already broken. Let the thing you have been holding at a careful angle be set down, not because it does not matter, and because it matters so much that it deserves to be held honestly. The stars over Nanda's field were very clear. He had looked at these same stars since he was young enough that they seemed impossibly far away. They still seemed impossibly far away, but somewhere along the path of this story, the distance had become less frightening and more. He searched for the word and found only beautiful. The distance was beautiful. The dark was full of things lit from within. He did not know how many more cold seasons he had. No one does, but he had this one. He had this fire. He had 20 names he could say in the dark, and 20 animals who would answer to them. And he had folded now in the pocket of Punna's old robe a piece of cloth he had found by the river 3 years ago, and which had turned out to belong to someone who had walked the same path he was walking and who had arrived. That was enough. That is the teaching. not as doctrine, as experience, as a cowherd sitting by a fire on a cold night, not cooler inside than he has ever been, watching his cows breathe, saying their names quietly to the stars. That is enough. You are enough. Rest now. You have walked a long way tonight, from the riverbank in the mist where a man picked up a yellow cloth and didn't know why. Through the rains and the counting and the grief and the questions and the conversation at the water's edge, where someone finally asked the thing that had been too large to ask. Through the barber's silk on a tree, through the child who looked up, through the bowl that was already broken. You have been with Nanda, and now the story is almost over. Let it settle around you the way a blanket settles, not with weight, with warmth. There are 3 things this river remembers. 3 things I want to leave with you tonight before you close your eyes and let sleep come. The first is this: poverty is not a spiritual obstacle, never was. The teacher did not go to the palace first and come to the field later. He stopped on a muddy road to speak to a cowherd. He stopped at the edge of a charnel ground to ask a child his name. He received a barber before princes. He walked toward the people that the world walked past. The Dhamma was never reserved for the educated, the wealthy, the well-placed, the remembered. It was always available to whoever was willing to look. Whatever your version of Nanda's field is, whatever form the ordinary, difficult, insufficient life takes for you, it is not a disqualification. It is the ground you are standing on, and that ground is enough to begin. The second thing, you do not have to leave your life to find the teaching in it. Nanda never became a monk. He went back to his cows every morning. For the rest of his years, he counted them. He knew their names. He sat under his fig tree in the eastern pasture and ate his flatbread and watched the river. But he was not the same man doing those things. The bowl was still the bowl, but he could see it clearly now. The teaching does not require renunciation of the ordinary. It does not ask you to become someone else in a different place with a different life. It asks you to look at the life you have, honestly, clearly, with the willingness to let it be what it is. Impermanent, complicated, full of grief and grace in roughly equal measure. That looking is the practice. Every morning, every counting, every name. And the third thing, the question you are carrying, the question underneath all the other questions, the one you have not quite said aloud, the one that sounds something like, is there anything here for someone like me? That question is not the obstacle. It is the door. Nanda asked it on a road. And the answer was, you are already walking. You have already begun. The Dhamma does not wait for you to be ready. It moves toward whoever is paying attention, the way the river moves toward the lowest point. Not because the ground is weak, but because the ground is open. You are here, listening to a story about a man who had nothing, whose name no text recorded, who counted his cows every morning as a form of prayer, who carried a yellow cloth for 3 rainy seasons without knowing what it meant, who asked the simplest question and found the Dhamma already moving, already in motion, long before he had a word for it. That is the story, and it is yours. Before you drift into sleep tonight, if you are still with me, there is one question I want to ask, not about Nanda, about you. What is the thing you have been carrying that you did not know was a form of practice? What is the name you say in the dark that is, without you having planned it, a form of prayer? Leave it in the comments if you like. Not for my sake, because sometimes the naming of a thing in a place where others can witness it changes the weight of it. We carry things more lightly when they are not only ours, and now the river is still running, the mist is still on the water. Somewhere in a field, 20 cows are breathing. A man sits by his fire, counting stars. The yellow cloth is where it belongs. The bowl is already broken. And the world, this ordinary, difficult, beautiful, impermanent world, holds you. It always has. Before the last word of this story leaves the air, let me stay with you for just a little longer. because sometimes the end of a story is the hardest moment. You have been held by something for these hours, by the voice, by the river, by the names of 20 cows and one yellow cloth and a question asked on a muddy road. And now it is ending, and the room where you are lying is just a room again, and the dark is just the dark. Let the story stay with you, not as something to remember, not as something to analyze, not as something to carry forward into the busy world of tomorrow's lists and plans. Let it stay the way warmth stays in a stone long after the sun has moved. You have been the river tonight, running without asking permission toward your own level. That is all any of us are doing. The mist will be on the water tomorrow morning. Nanda will count his cows, and somewhere in the act of the counting, in the naming of the names, in the particular quality of attention that knows what it is tending, the Dhamma will be there, not announced, just present, the way rivers are present, the way the dark is present before sleep, the way you are present right now at the edge of the night. Let your body be heavy now. Let your hands rest. Let the questions you came in with tonight be set down gently, the way you set down something you have been carrying all day and have only just realized how long you have been carrying it. There is nothing you need to resolve before morning. There is nothing you need to understand before you can rest. The river does not stop running when you are not watching it. The teaching does not require your vigilance to remain true. It was true before you arrive. It will be true when you wake, and in the space between, in the long quiet hours where the mind lets go and the body breathes and the dark holds everything in that space, something continues. Something in you without being asked, without effort, without the need for your permission. The bowl is already broken. The cloth is where it belongs. The cowherd has found his rest, and so can you sleep well. The river remembers everything.